There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to the open sea at night. It is not the silence of emptiness, nor the silence of absence, but rather the silence of enormity, a hush so vast and so deep that it seems almost alive, breathing slowly in time, with the distant rhythm of waves breaking against a hull of iron and steel. And it is within that silence, on a night now more than a century old, that one of the most extraordinary stories in all of human history began its final, terrible chapter. Tonight, we step aboard a ship that has never truly left our collective imagination, a vessel so grand, so ambitious, and so tragically doomed that her name alone still carries the weight of an entire era's hopes and sorrows. Tonight, we board the Titanic. If you find yourself drawn into this story, if the voices of these long-ago passengers begin to feel real and present and close, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and stay for the journey. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told, and each one deserves the same quiet attention we're about to give to the men, women, and children who sailed aboard the most famous ship the world has ever known. The year was 1912, and the world was a place of breathtaking contrasts. In the great capitals of Europe and America, electric lights blazed along boulevards, where horse-drawn carriages still clattered beside the first sputtering automobiles. The old century had barely ended, and yet the new one was already announcing itself with a confidence that bordered on recklessness. Empires stretched across continents. Factories roared through the night. Railroads stitched together nations that had once seemed impossibly distant from one another. And on the North Atlantic, the great shipping lines competed with one another in a race that was as much about national pride as it was about commerce. A race to build the largest, the fastest, the most luxurious ocean liner the world had ever seen. It was in this atmosphere of relentless ambition that the White Star Line conceived of a vessel so magnificent that she would render all previous ships obsolete. Her name would be Titanic, drawn from the Titans of Greek mythology, those ancient gods who had once ruled the heavens before being overthrown by forces greater than themselves. It was a name chosen for its grandeur, its sense of invincible power. And yet, in the cruel light of hindsight, it carries a warning that no one in those heady days of early spring could have heard. The Titans, after all, had fallen. They had been brought low by their own certainty, by their belief that nothing in the universe could challenge their supremacy. But that cautionary echo was lost beneath the thunderous excitement of what the White Star Line was about to achieve. And in the shipyards of Belfast, Northern Ireland, the greatest ocean liner ever built was taking shape, rivet by rivet, plate by plate, dream by impossible dream. The Titanic was not merely a ship. She was a floating civilization, a self-contained world of extraordinary complexity and breathtaking beauty. From her keel to the tips of her 4 towering funnels, she measured approximately 882 feet in length, making her, at the time of her construction, the largest movable object ever created by human hands. Her hull was fashioned from steel plates, each one carefully shaped and riveted into place by teams of men who worked in conditions of staggering noise and danger, high above the floor of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, where she had been born. More than 15,000 men had labored to bring her into existence, and the process had taken roughly 3 years from the laying of her keel on the 31st of March, 1909, to the day she was finally ready to receive her first passengers. and what passengers they would be. The Titanic was designed not merely to transport people across the Atlantic Ocean, but to do so in a style that would rival the finest hotels in London, Paris, and New York. Her first-class accommodations were nothing short of palatial, featuring grand staircases carved from solid oak and illuminated by a vast glass dome that flooded the entrance hall with natural light during the day and glowed with electric warmth after dark. There were dining saloons that could seat hundreds, decorated in the style of English country houses, with mahogany paneling, leaded glass windows, and tables set with fine china and crystal that caught the light and scattered it like liquid diamonds across the white linen tablecloths. There were smoking rooms panelled in dark wood with stained glass windows, a gymnasium equipped with the latest exercise machines, a heated swimming pool, Turkish baths with ornate tiled walls and brass fixtures, and a veranda cafe where passengers could sit beneath climbing plants and wrought iron trellises and imagine, if only for a moment, that they were not at sea at all, but rather enjoying a quiet afternoon in some elegant garden overlooking the Mediterranean. But the Titanic was more than a palace for the wealthy. She was also a vessel of hope for the hundreds of third-class passengers who boarded her with far more modest expectations, but dreams that burned no less brightly. For many of these men, women, and children, the Titanic represented the final leg of a journey that had already carried them across entire countries and through years of hardship and uncertainty. They came from Ireland and England, from Sweden and Norway, from Finland and Lebanon, from Italy and Croatia, and the vast, troubled expanses of the Russian Empire. They carried battered suitcases and cloth bundles tied with string. They wore their best clothes, which were often their only clothes, and they clutched papers and documents that they hoped would grant them entry to the promised land on the far side of the ocean. America. The word itself was a kind of prayer, a whispered invocation of everything they longed for and everything they were leaving behind. The night of April the 10th, 1912, the Titanic lay alongside the dock at Southampton, England, blazing with light from stem to stern, her four great funnels rising against the evening sky like the columns of some impossible temple dedicated to the gods of progress and human ingenuity. All along the quayside, families gathered to say their farewells, and the scene was one of extraordinary emotional complexity. There was excitement, certainly, the giddy thrill of departure, the sense of embarking upon an adventure unlike any other. But there was also anxiety, the quiet worry that always accompanies an ocean crossing, the awareness, however dimly felt, that the sea is vast and indifferent, and that every voyage across its surface is, in some fundamental sense, an act of faith. Among the passengers who boarded the Titanic that evening were some of the wealthiest and most prominent individuals in the English-speaking world. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, was traveling with his young wife Madeline, who was 5 months pregnant with their first child. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate, had come aboard with his valet and his mistress, a French singer named Leontine Aubard. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who co-owned the great department store Macy's in New York, were returning home after a winter spent in the warmer climates of Europe. Margaret Brown, the outspoken socialite from Denver, Colorado, who would later earn the nickname the unsinkable Molly Brown, had boarded at Cherbourg, France. after cutting short a vacation to be with her ailing grandson. And then there were the hundreds of less famous, but no less remarkable human beings, whose stories would be woven into the fabric of that terrible night. There was the Goodwin family, from Wiltshire, England, Frederick and Augusta, and their 6 children, the youngest of whom was only 19 months old. All of them traveling in 3rd class with dreams of starting a new life in Niagara Falls, New York. There was Father Thomas Biles, a Roman Catholic priest who was crossing the Atlantic to officiate at his brother's wedding in New York, and who would, in the final hours, become a figure of extraordinary spiritual courage. There was Wallace Hartley, the 33-year-old violinist from Lancashire, who led the ship's orchestra, and who would achieve a kind of immortality for the music he played as the great vessel sank beneath the waves. Each of these people, and the more than 2,200 others who sailed aboard the Titanic on her maiden voyage, carried within them a world of private hopes and fears, of memories and longings, of relationships and responsibilities that were as vivid and as real as anything in our own lives today. And it is those inner worlds, those deeply human stories of love and loss, of courage and cowardice, of quiet dignity and desperate fear, that we will explore together in the hours ahead. Because the story of the Titanic is not, at its deepest level, a story about a ship. It is a story about people. It is a story about what happens when the vast, impersonal forces of nature collide with the fragile, beautiful, impossibly complex reality of individual human lives. So let the great engines fall quiet for a moment. Let the noise of the modern world fade into the background. And let us step back across the years, past 2 world wars and 100 revolutions and 1,000 smaller dramas, back to a time when the century was still young and the future seemed limitless, and a great ship was setting out across the dark Atlantic waters on a voyage that would change the world forever. The dock at Southampton is crowded with well-wishers. The air is sharp with the smell of coal smoke and salt water. High above, against a pale April sky, the Titanic's funnels release thin plumes of steam that drift and dissolve like the last visible traces of a world that is about to vanish. And somewhere, deep in the belly of the ship, the great triple expansion engines are beginning to turn. Slowly at first, then with gathering power and purpose, driving the Titanic forward into the channel and out toward the open sea. The maiden voyage had begun. To understand the Titanic, to truly grasp the magnitude of what she represented and the depth of the tragedy that would consume her, one must first understand the world that brought her into being. And that world was the Edwardian Age, a period of history so distinctive in its character and so influential in its legacy that it has come to feel almost like a separate civilization, a way of life that existed in that strange luminous interval between the long Victorian twilight and the catastrophic dawn of the First World War. The Edwardian era, named for King Edward VII, who reigned over the British Empire from 1901 until 1910, was an age of extraordinary paradoxes. On the surface, it was a time of elegance and optimism, of garden parties and country house weekends, of elaborate hats and long white gloves, and afternoon tea served on silver trays beneath the shade of ancient oaks. The British Empire was at the zenith of its power, stretching across a quarter of the globe, and London was the undisputed capital of the world, a city of 6.5 million souls that served as the nerve centre of an international network of trade, diplomacy, and military might that had no historical precedent. But beneath that polished surface, darker currents were flowing. The same industrial revolution that had made Britain the workshop of the world had also created vast urban slums where millions lived in conditions of appalling poverty, crowded into tenements without proper sanitation or clean water, laboring in factories and mines for wages that barely sustained life. The gap between rich and poor was not merely wide, but seemingly unbridgeable, a chasm that separated two entirely different species of human experience. A wealthy Edwardian gentleman might spend more on a single dinner at the Ritz than a factory worker earned in a month. A society hostess might change her clothes 5 or 6 times in a single day, each outfit worth more than the total annual income of a family living in the East End of London. And this inequality was not hidden or apologized for, but rather accepted by many as the natural and inevitable order of things, a reflection of some deeper law of nature or providence that assigned each person their proper station in life. It was this rigidly stratified society that the Titanic was designed to mirror and to serve. When the White Star Line commissioned the construction of the Titanic and her sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, they were not merely building vessels to carry passengers across the Atlantic. They were building floating emblems of the Edwardian class system, ships in which the divisions between rich and poor, between privilege and servitude, between those who commanded and those who obeyed, were physically embodied in the architecture of the vessel itself. Consider for a moment what this meant in practical terms. The Titanic had 3 classes of accommodation, and the boundaries between them were not merely social conventions but physical barriers, gates and doors and staircases that kept the classes separated as completely as if they had been travelling on different ships entirely. A first-class passenger who paid the equivalent of nearly 80,000 modern dollars for a deluxe suite could wander freely through some of the most luxurious interior spaces ever created, from the grand staircase with its ornate clock and its carved oak balustrades, to the first-class dining saloon where meals of 10 or 12 courses were served on bone china with sterling silver flatware. A third-class passenger who had paid perhaps $35 for a berth in a shared cabin deep in the lower decks had access to none of these wonders. They ate in a plain dining room where the food was adequate but simple. They socialized in a general room that, while clean and reasonably comfortable, bore no resemblance whatsoever to the palatial spaces enjoyed by the wealthy passengers above them. And they were prevented from crossing into the upper-class sections of the ship by locked gates and watchful stewards, invisible to the eyes of those who dined and danced and strolled the promenade decks in their evening clothes, as remote from the first-class passengers as the servants' quarters in a great country house were from the drawing room. This was not unique to the Titanic, of course. Every ocean liner of the period maintained similar divisions. And indeed, the Titanic's third-class accommodations were considerably better than those offered by most of her competitors. Where other ships crammed their steerage passengers into vast open dormitories with hundreds of bunks stacked 3 or 4 high, the Titanic offered small cabins that accommodated 2, 4, or 6 passengers, with real mattresses, clean bedding, and running water. The food served in third class was plentiful and nutritious, and many of the immigrants who sailed aboard the Titanic later recalled, in the few brief days before the disaster, that they had never eaten so well in their lives. For people who had come from villages in rural Ireland, where a meal of potatoes and buttermilk was considered generous, or from the hard-scrabble farms of Scandinavia, where winter could mean months of near starvation. The abundance of the Titanic's third-class dining room must have seemed almost miraculous. But the fact that third-class passengers on the Titanic were treated better than steerage passengers on other ships does not alter the fundamental reality that the vessel was designed, from the waterline to the boat deck, as a physical manifestation of social hierarchy. The best views, the finest food, the most spacious quarters, the greatest freedom of movement, all of these belong to those who could pay the most. And when the crisis came, when the ship struck the iceberg and began her slow, inexorable descent into the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, those same divisions would play a devastating role in determining who lived and who died. The world that built the Titanic was also a world intoxicated by its own technological achievements. The pace of innovation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was staggering, almost beyond comprehension, even by the standards of our own restless age. Within living memory, humanity had progressed from horse-drawn coaches and sailing ships to railroads, steamships, the telegraph, the telephone, the electric light, the automobile, and most recently and most astonishingly, the aeroplane. The Wright brothers had made their first powered flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, less than a decade before the Titanic set sail. And already there were those who dreamed of crossing the Atlantic by air, a feat that would have seemed like pure fantasy to anyone born before the Civil War. This headlong rush of progress bred a particular kind of confidence, a belief that there were no limits to what human intelligence and human industry could achieve. Nature, which had once seemed omnipotent and terrifying, was being tamed and mastered at every turn. Rivers were dammed, mountains were tunneled through, deserts were irrigated, diseases that had killed millions were being conquered by the new science of bacteriology. And on the ocean, the last great frontier of human transportation, ships were growing larger, faster, and, or so it was believed, safer with every passing year. It was in this context that the phrase practically unsinkable first entered the public imagination in connection with the Titanic. The exact origin of the claim has been much debated by historians, but it appears to have originated in a trade publication called The Shipbuilder, which in a 1911 article about the Titanic and her sister ship Olympic described them as practically unsinkable on account of their innovative system of watertight compartments. The Titanic's hull was divided into 16 compartments, separated by bulkheads, fitted with watertight doors that could be closed from the bridge at the touch of a switch. The ship had been designed to stay afloat, even if any two of her compartments, or certain combinations of 3 or even 4 compartments, were flooded. This was a remarkable feat of naval engineering, and it is perhaps understandable that the public, already predisposed to believe in the invincibility of modern technology, seized upon the qualifier practically and quietly dropped it, transforming a cautious engineering assessment into an absolute declaration of indestructibility. The Titanic was unsinkable. That was the common belief, the shared assumption, the background certainty against which all the events of her maiden voyage unfolded. And it was this belief, more than any single technical failing or navigational error, that would prove to be the ship's most fatal flaw. Because a ship that cannot sink does not need enough lifeboats for all her passengers. A ship that cannot sink does not need to slow down when ice warnings are received by wireless. A ship that cannot sink does not need to inspire the same degree of caution and humility that every sailor, from the most ancient mariner to the most modern captain, has always understood to be the first requirement of life at sea. The men who designed and built the Titanic were not fools, and they were not negligent in the ordinary sense of the word. Thomas Andrews, the chief designer and managing director of Harland and Wolff's design department, was a brilliant naval architect who had devoted his professional life to the art and science of shipbuilding. He loved the Titanic as a parent loves a child, and he sailed with her on her maiden voyage, not as a passenger, but as a working professional, observing every detail of her performance and making notes about improvements and adjustments that could be incorporated into future vessels. He was a man of deep integrity and profound technical skill, and it is one of the cruelest ironies of the Titanic story that the ship he had poured his heart and soul into building would become the instrument of his own death. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, was a more complicated figure. A man whose reputation would be savagely torn apart in the aftermath of the disaster. Ismay was not a shipbuilder, but a businessman, the son of the company's founder, and he had inherited both the family business and the family ambition. It was Ismay who had conceived the idea of building 3 great sister ships that would dominate the transatlantic trade. And it was Ismay who had insisted that these ships should compete not on speed, as the rival Cunard lines Lusitania and Mauretania did, but on size and luxury. The Titanic would not be the fastest ship on the Atlantic, but she would be the most magnificent, the most comfortable, the most awe-inspiring vessel ever to sail. And then there was Captain Edward John Smith, the man who would command the Titanic on her first and only voyage. Smith was 62 years old in April of 1912, a tall, bearded, distinguished-looking man who had spent nearly 40 years at sea, and who was, by all accounts, one of the most experienced and respected captains in the merchant marine. He had commanded 17 different ships for the White Star Line, and he had been chosen to captain the Titanic in part because of his impeccable record, and in part because of his easy, reassuring manner, which made him a favorite with the wealthy passengers who traveled first class. Captain Smith was known to his officers as E.J., and to the press as the millionaires' captain, and he had announced that the Titanic's maiden voyage would be his last before retirement. After decades of service, he intended to spend his remaining years quietly at his home in Southampton with his wife Eleanor and their daughter Helen. It is a poignant detail that planned retirement, one of those small, deeply human facts that remind us of the terrible gap between the life we imagine for ourselves and the life that actually awaits us. Captain Smith could not have known, as he stood on the bridge of the Titanic and watched the green hills of Ireland fade into the distance on the afternoon of April the 11th, that he was not sailing toward retirement and rest, but toward a rendezvous with an iceberg that had been drifting south from the glaciers of Greenland for perhaps 2 or 3 years, following the slow, cold currents of the Labrador Sea until it reached the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic at precisely the wrong moment in the history of the world. But of course, no one on the Titanic knew what lay ahead. And that is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire story, the knowledge that we possess, and they did not. the unbearable weight of hindsight that allows us to see, with terrible clarity, the catastrophe that was approaching while the passengers and crew went about their daily routines with no more sense of impending doom than we ourselves feel on any ordinary evening. They dressed for dinner. They wrote letters and postcards to be mailed from New York. They made plans for their arrival, booking hotel rooms and arranging to be met at the pier by friends and family members who would wait in vain. They looked out at the ocean and saw beauty and possibility and the shining promise of the future, not knowing that the future, for many of them, had already been reduced to a matter of hours. The world that built the Titanic was a world that believed in progress, in the power of human ingenuity to overcome any obstacle and solve any problem. It was a world that had not yet been humbled by the trenches of the Western Front, by the influenza pandemic of 1918, by the Great Depression and the rise of totalitarianism and the horrors of a Second World War. It was a world that still believed, with touching and terrible sincerity, that the future would be better than the past, that the arc of history bent toward improvement and enlightenment, and that the great machines of the modern age were not merely tools, but symbols of humanity's triumphant march toward mastery over nature itself. The Titanic was the supreme expression of that belief, and her destruction was, in many ways, the first crack in the foundation of an entire civilization's confidence. When she sank, she took with her not only the lives of more than 1,500 men, women, and children, but also something less tangible and perhaps equally precious: the innocent faith that the world was getting better and that human beings, armed with science and technology and the accumulated wisdom of the ages, could build structures and systems that were truly proof against disaster. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the iceberg, before the freezing water, before the terrible silence that fell over the North Atlantic in the early hours of April the 15th, there were days of extraordinary beauty and wonder. Days when the Titanic was alive and whole and moving through the sea like a great floating city. Her decks crowded with people whose stories deserve to be remembered and whose voices, even now, across a distance of more than a century, can still be heard if we are willing to listen with patience and with care. The ship's departure from Southampton on Wednesday, April the 10th, 1912, was itself an event of considerable drama. As the Titanic was being maneuvered out of her berth by a team of tugboats, her enormous displacement caused a powerful suction effect that pulled a smaller vessel, the SS New York, away from her moorings. The New York swung toward the Titanic, and for a few breathless moments, it appeared that a collision was inevitable, one that could have damaged the Titanic's hull and delayed or even cancelled the maiden voyage. But quick action by the tugboat captains and by Captain Smith himself, who ordered the Titanic's port propeller to be put astern, creating a wash that pushed the New York away, averted the disaster by a margin of perhaps 4 feet. Some passengers who witnessed the near collision took it as a bad omen, a warning from the sea itself that this voyage was not meant to be. Others laughed it off as a minor incident, an inconvenience quickly forgotten in the excitement of the departure. But in retrospect, it is impossible not to see in that moment a kind of dark foreshadowing, a whisper from the future that no one was prepared to hear. From Southampton, the Titanic crossed the English Channel to Cherbourg, France, where she dropped anchor in the outer harbour and took on additional passengers who were ferried out to the ship by tender boats, as the harbour was too shallow for the great liner to dock directly. It was at Cherbourg that some of the wealthiest passengers boarded, including John Jacob Astor and his wife, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Margaret Brown. The stop was brief, lasting only about 90 minutes, and then the Titanic raised her anchor and set course for Queenstown, on the southern coast of Ireland, her last port of call before the open Atlantic. She arrived at Queenstown on the morning of Thursday, April the 11th, and the scene there was markedly different from the elegant boarding at Cherbourg. At Queenstown, it was the emigrants who came aboard, the Irish men and women and children who were leaving their homeland for the last time, bound for a new life in America, with all the hope and heartbreak that such a journey entailed. Many of them were young, barely out of their teens, travelling alone or in small groups of friends and neighbours from the same village or county. They had sold everything they owned to pay for their passage, and they carried their entire lives in a single trunk or bag. 113 third-class passengers boarded at Queenstown, along with a small number of second-class travellers. Among them was a young Irish woman named Margaret Rice, a widow who was travelling with her 5 sons, the oldest of whom was 10 and the youngest just 2 years old. She was bound for Spokane, Washington, where she hoped to join relatives who had emigrated years before. None of them would survive the sinking. There was also a group of young Irish women, friends from County Mayo, who were emigrating to America together. Full of nervous laughter and whispered prayers, and the bittersweet awareness that they might never see Ireland again. And there was a solitary figure standing at the rail as the tender pulled away from the Queenstown dock, an Irishman named Eugene Patrick Daly, who played his Willian pipes as the green coast of Ireland receded into the mist, filling the air with a melody so mournful and so beautiful that several of the passengers standing nearby were moved to tears. At 1:30 in the afternoon on April the 11th, the Titanic's anchor was raised for the last time, and she turned her bow toward the west and the open Atlantic. Behind her, the coast of Ireland grew smaller and hazier, fading from green to grey to blue, until it was nothing more than a smudge on the eastern horizon, and then nothing at all. Ahead of her lay 2,000 miles of open ocean, and at the far end of that ocean, the lights and towers of New York City, where she was expected to arrive on the morning of Wednesday, April the 17th. She would never see New York, but for now, for these few precious days between the old world and the new, the Titanic was a world unto herself, a tiny, glittering civilization adrift on the immensity of the Atlantic, carrying within her steel walls a cross-section of Edwardian society so complete and so richly varied that it might have been assembled by a novelist with a particularly keen eye for the contrasts and contradictions of the human condition. To walk the decks of the Titanic during those first days at sea was to pass through a series of worlds, each one separated from the next by invisible but immovable boundaries of wealth and class and social standing. And yet, for all their differences, the passengers in every class shared at least one thing in common: the profound, almost otherworldly experience of being at sea on the largest ship ever built, surrounded by water in every direction, cradled by the deep, rhythmic vibration of the engines far below, and the gentle, ceaseless rocking of the hull against the waves. In first class, life aboard the Titanic was an exercise in refined luxury, that has rarely been equaled, even by the most opulent cruise ships of our own era. The first-class passengers occupied the upper decks of the ship, where the air was freshest and the views most commanding, and they moved through a sequence of public rooms that had been designed to evoke the great architectural traditions of Europe. The first-class dining saloon, located on D-deck, was the largest room afloat, stretching the entire width of the ship and capable of seating more than 500 guests at a single sitting. Its decor was inspired by Hatfield House, the Jacobean country mansion in Hertfordshire that had been home to the Cecil family for centuries, and the effect was one of stately grandeur, with carved oak chairs, white linen tablecloths, and menus that offered a staggering variety of dishes prepared by a team of French and Italian chefs who had been recruited from some of the finest restaurants and hotels in Europe. A typical dinner in the first-class saloon might begin with oysters, followed by consommé, then a choice of salmon or filet mignon or roast duckling, accompanied by an array of vegetables and side dishes, followed by a fruit and cheese course, and concluding with an elaborate dessert such as Waldorf pudding or French ice cream or an assortment of petits fours. The wine list was equally impressive, featuring champagnes from the great houses of Reims and Epernay, clarets from Bordeaux, and Burgundies that had been carefully selected by the White Star Line's wine steward. Each course was served with quiet efficiency by a team of stewards in crisp white jackets, and the entire meal might last 2 or 3 hours, providing not merely sustenance, but a complete theatrical experience in which food, wine, conversation, and the gentle sway of the ship combined to create a sense of well-being and contentment that was, for many passengers, the defining pleasure of the voyage. But dinner was only one of many diversions available to the first-class passengers. In the mornings, they might visit the gymnasium on the boat deck, where a cheerful physical instructor named Thomas Macaulay demonstrated the use of rowing machines, exercise bicycles, and a mechanical device that simulated horseback riding. They could swim in the heated saltwater pool on F deck, or take a Turkish bath in the elaborately tiled rooms that adjoined it, emerging pink and glowing into the cool sea air. They could read in the first-class library, or a hushed, carpeted room filled with leather-bound volumes and comfortable armchairs, or write letters in the first-class writing room. A bright, airy space decorated in the Georgian style, with white walls and delicate mouldings. They could play cards in the smoking room, a richly panelled sanctum that served as the unofficial clubhouse for the first-class gentlemen, where brandy and cigars were consumed in quantities that would alarm a modern physician, but were considered entirely normal and even necessary by the standards of the day. And then there was the Café Parisien, a charming addition that was unique to the Titanic, as her sister ship Olympic did not have one. Located on B deck, the Café Parisien was designed to recreate the atmosphere of a sidewalk cafe in Paris, with wicker furniture and climbing plants and large windows that offered panoramic views of the passing ocean. It was a particular favorite of the younger first-class passengers, who gathered there for coffee and conversation, and the kind of gentle, purposeless socializing that was one of the great arts of the Edwardian upper class. Among the most prominent first-class passengers were people whose names were synonymous with wealth and power in the early 20th century. John Jacob Astor IV was perhaps the most famous of them all, a man whose fortune, inherited from his great-grandfather, the fur-trading pioneer John Jacob Astor, was estimated at nearly $90 million, the equivalent of several billion in today's money. Asta was 47 years old, tall and reserved, with a neat moustache and the air of quiet authority that comes from having been born into privilege so complete that it renders ambition almost unnecessary. He was travelling with his second wife, Madeleine Force Asta, who was only 18 years old and who was 5 months pregnant. Their marriage had been a society scandal, as Madeleine was younger than Asta's son Vincent from his first marriage. And the couple had spent the winter in Europe and Egypt, partly to escape the wagging tongues of New York society. Asta was a man of considerable intellectual curiosity, as well as enormous wealth. He had written a science fiction novel called A Journey in Other Worlds, which imagined the exploration of Saturn and Jupiter in the year 2000. He had invented a bicycle brake and a machine for flattening roads. He had served as a colonel in the Spanish-American War, equipping an artillery battery at his own expense. And now, as the Titanic carried him westward across the Atlantic, he was looking forward to the birth of his child and to a quieter, more settled life in New York, far from the gossip and the criticism that had followed his remarriage. Benjamin Guggenheim, another of the Titanic's most illustrious passengers, was a different kind of wealthy man altogether. Where Asta was reserved and bookish, Guggenheim was flamboyant and worldly, a man who loved beautiful women and fine living, and who had largely abandoned the family mining business to pursue a life of pleasure in the capitals of Europe. He had boarded the Titanic at Cherbourg with his valet, Victor Guillot, and his French mistress, Madame Léontine Aubard, a cabaret singer whom he had met in Paris. His wife, Florette, and their 3 daughters were at home in New York, unaware that Benjamin was not travelling alone. Then there were Isidore and Ida Strauss, who stand out among the Titanic's first-class passengers, not for the size of their fortune, though it was considerable, but for the depth and constancy of their love for each other. Isidore Strauss was 67 years old, a German-born immigrant who had built the Macy's department store into one of the most successful retail enterprises in America. Ida, his wife of more than 40 years, was 63, a small, quiet woman who had been devoted to her husband since they were young. They had travelled to Europe together for the winter season, as was their custom, and they were returning home on the Titanic with their manservant and maid. In the days ahead, their story would become one of the most celebrated and most heartbreaking of all the many human dramas that unfolded aboard the sinking ship. In second class, the accommodations were more modest but still remarkably comfortable, far superior to the first-class cabins on many smaller and older ships. The second-class passengers were a diverse group that included teachers, clergymen, engineers, small business owners, and other representatives of the respectable middle class, people who could not afford the extravagant prices of first class, but who had sufficient means to travel in a degree of comfort that would have been unthinkable for their grandparents. The second-class dining saloon was an elegant room panelled in oak, with long tables set with white linen and good quality china. The menu, while not as elaborate as that in first class, was still impressive by any ordinary standard, offering multiple courses at every meal and a variety of choices that reflected the international character of the cuisine. There was a second-class library, a smoking room, and a spacious promenade deck where passengers could stroll and enjoy the sea air. The cabins were clean, well furnished, and equipped with running water, electric lighting, and comfortable berths. Among the second-class passengers were several individuals whose stories would be remembered long after the disaster. There was Lawrence Beasley, a 34-year-old science teacher from Dulwich, London, who was traveling to America for a holiday, and who would later write one of the most vivid and detailed eyewitness accounts of the sinking, a book called The Loss of the SS Titanic, published just weeks after the disaster. Beasley was a keen observer, a man with a scientist's eye for detail and a writer's gift for description. And his account of life aboard the Titanic in those last days before the catastrophe remains one of our most valuable sources of information about what it was actually like to be on that ship. There was also Eva Hart, a 7-year-old girl who was traveling with her parents, Benjamin and Esther Hart, from Ilford in Essex to Winnipeg, Canada, where Benjamin hoped to start a new life as a builder. Eva's mother, Esther, had been deeply uneasy about the voyage from the very beginning, troubled by what she considered the arrogance of calling any ship unsinkable, and she had refused to sleep at night, sitting up in her cabin fully dressed while her husband and daughter slept, convinced that something terrible was going to happen. It was a premonition that would prove to be tragically accurate. And there was Michel Navratil, a Slovak tailor living in France who had kidnapped his own 2 sons, Michel Jr., age 3, and Edmond, age 2, after separating from his wife, and who was taking them to America under assumed names. The boys, who spoke only French, would become known in the aftermath of the disaster as the Titanic Orphans. Their true identity, a mystery for weeks until their frantic mother saw their photographs in a newspaper and crossed the Atlantic to reclaim them. Down in 3rd class, in the lower decks of the ship, life was simpler, but not without its own pleasures and its own kind of community. The 3rd-class passengers were overwhelmingly immigrants, people who were leaving everything they knew behind in the hope of building new lives in America. They came from dozens of different countries and spoke dozens of different languages, and the result was a polyglot society of extraordinary diversity, a miniature Tower of Babel, in which hand gestures and shared meals and the universal language of music served as the primary means of communication. The 3rd-class cabins were small but clean, with 2 or 4 bunks, a wash basin, and a small mirror. The communal bathrooms were shared among many passengers, and there were separate facilities for men and women. The 3rd-class dining saloon was a plain, functional room where meals were served at long communal tables. And the food, while simple, was abundant and nourishing, consisting of porridge and bread and fruit for breakfast, soup and meat and potatoes for lunch, and a substantial supper that might include roast beef or stewed rabbit or baked fish. In the evenings, the 3rd-class general room became the social heart of the lower decks, a space where passengers gathered to sing songs, tell stories, play cards, and dance. The music was often provided by passengers themselves, men and women who had brought instruments from home, fiddles and concertinas and tin whistles and pipes, and the resulting concerts were boisterous, joyful affairs that spanned half a dozen cultures and musical traditions. An Irish jig might be followed by a Scandinavian folk song, which might give way to an Italian aria, and then everyone would join together for a polka or a waltz, the couples spinning and laughing in the close, warm, smoke-filled air, while the great ship rolled gently beneath their feet. Among the 3rd-class passengers were some of the most poignant figures in the entire Titanic story. There was the Sage family from Peterborough, England, the largest family on the ship, consisting of John and Annie Sage and their 9 children, ranging in age from 4 to 20. They were emigrating to Jacksonville, Florida, where John had purchased a pecan farm, and they traveled in a group of 3 cabins on F deck. All 11 members of the Sage family would perish in the sinking, making theirs the largest single family loss of the disaster. There was Rhoda Abbott, a 39-year-old Englishwoman who was returning to Providence, Rhode Island, with her 2 teenage sons, Rossmore and Eugene, after visiting family in England. She would be the only woman in 3rd class to be pulled alive from the water after the sinking, but she would lose both of her sons, a grief from which she never recovered. There were the Panela family from Finland, Maria and her 5 young sons, the youngest of whom, Eno, was only 13 months old. They were traveling to Coal Center, Pennsylvania, to join Maria's partner, who had emigrated earlier to find work in the mines. None of them survived. And there were hundreds of others, young men and women traveling alone, newlywed couples starting married life with an ocean voyage, elderly grandparents who had been persuaded to make the journey by children already settled in America, each one carrying a story of hope and courage and quiet desperation that deserves to be remembered. The crew of the Titanic, numbering approximately 885 men and women, formed yet another distinct community within the ship's floating world. They ranged from the most senior officers, experienced mariners who had spent decades at sea, to the lowliest trimmers and stokers who labored in the hellish heat of the boiler rooms, shoveling coal into the great furnaces that powered the engines. Between these extremes were hundreds of stewards and stewardesses, cooks and bakers, engineers and electricians, musicians and bellboys, each one performing a specialized role in the complex machinery of shipboard life. The stokers and trimmers occupied the lowest rung of the crew hierarchy, and their work was among the most brutal and exhausting in the maritime world. The Titanic's boiler rooms contained 29 boilers, most of them double-ended, and each one had to be fed a constant supply of coal to maintain the steam pressure that drove the engines. The men who performed this labor worked in temperatures that routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, stripped to the waist, their skin blackened with coal dust, their muscles aching from the endless repetitive motion of lifting and throwing, hour after hour, in shifts of 4 hours on and 8 hours off. They were paid modest wages, and their quarters, deep in the forward sections of the ship, were cramped and Spartan, a far cry from the luxury of the decks above. And yet, for all the hardship, there was a rough camaraderie among the stokers, a bond forged in the shared furnace heat that transcended the ordinary divisions of class and nationality. They looked after one another, the experienced hands teaching the newcomers the tricks of the trade, how to read the color of the flames, how to distribute the coal evenly across the grate, how to time their brakes so that the boiler pressure never dropped below the level required by the engineers. And when the crisis came, many of these men would display a courage and selflessness that put to shame the behavior of some of their social superiors on the decks above. The ship's officers were a small, tightly knit group of experienced seamen who bore the heavy responsibility of navigating the Titanic safely across the Atlantic. Chief Officer Henry Wilde, First Officer William Murdoch, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, Third Officer Herbert Pittman, Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall, Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, and 6th Officer James Moody formed the bridge team. Each one a qualified master mariner with years of experience in the merchant service. They stood their watches in rotation, scanning the horizon for hazards, monitoring the ship's speed and heading, and maintaining the countless small adjustments and calculations that kept the Titanic on course. Among them, Lightoller would prove to be one of the most remarkable survivors of the disaster, a man whose personal history reads like an adventure novel. Before joining the White Star Line, he had survived a shipwreck off the coast of Africa, been stranded on a desert island, prospected for gold in the Klondike during the Great Gold Rush, worked as a cowboy in the Canadian West, and fought a fire at sea that lasted for days. He was tough, resourceful, and decisive, qualities that would serve him well in the terrible hours ahead. The ship also carried 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, young men in their 20s who were not technically employees of the White Star Line, but of the Marconi International Marine Communication Company. They worked in a small cabin on the boat deck, surrounded by their equipment, sending and receiving messages for the passengers and the ship's officers. The wireless apparatus on the Titanic was the most powerful afloat, capable of transmitting and receiving messages across distances of several hundred miles, and Phillips and Bride worked in shifts. One man always on duty, tapping out the dots and dashes of Morse code with a speed and accuracy that was the product of years of training and practice. In the days before the disaster, Phillips and Bride were kept enormously busy with passenger messages. Wealthy travelers sending and receiving telegrams to and from friends and business associates on shore. The novelty of being able to communicate by wireless from the middle of the ocean had not yet worn off, and the demand for the service was intense, creating a backlog of messages that kept Phillips working late into the night. This backlog would have terrible consequences on the evening of April the 14th, when ice warnings from other ships would compete for attention with the flood of personal telegrams that continued to pour in from the first-class passengers. But for now, in these last days of ordinary life, the wireless cabin was simply another of the Titanic's many marvels. A small room where the mysterious science of electromagnetic waves was harnessed to send the human voice, or at least its coded equivalent, leaping across the vast emptiness of the ocean at the speed of light. And the 2 young men who operated it, Jack Phillips with his serious, dedicated air, and Harold Bride with his easy smile and his love of practical jokes, were simply doing their jobs, unaware that they were about to play a central role in one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of human communication. The 14th of April, 1912, began like any other day at sea. The sun rose over a calm, glittering expanse of ocean, and the air was crisp and clear, with a quality of luminous stillness that comes only when the sky is perfectly cloudless and the sea is at rest. The Titanic moved steadily westward at a speed of approximately 21.5 knots, her great engines turning with a deep, rhythmic pulse that could be felt in every part of the ship, a kind of mechanical heartbeat that had become so familiar to the passengers that they scarcely noticed it anymore. In first class, the morning began with breakfast in the dining saloon, a leisurely meal of eggs and bacon, kippers and toast, fresh fruit and coffee, served on tables set with white linen and silver. The passengers ate and talked and read the ship's daily newspaper, the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, which was printed on board and contained wireless news from shore as well as details about the ship's speed and distance traveled during the previous 24 hours. The previous day's run had been impressive, 519 miles, and there was quiet speculation among some of the passengers that Captain Smith might push for an even better showing today, perhaps arriving in New York ahead of schedule. After breakfast, the morning hours were spent in the customary pursuits of shipboard life. Some passengers walked the promenade deck, wrapping themselves in thick coats against the increasingly cold air, and marveling at the endless panorama of the sea. Others retired to the library or the writing room, or visited the gymnasium, where instructor T.W. Macaulay, dressed in his white flannels, demonstrated the various machines with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed that a few minutes of exercise each day could cure any ailment. In the smoking room, a group of gentlemen had established a regular card game, and the sound of shuffling cards and quiet laughter drifted through the mahogany-panelled room like smoke from their cigars. At noon, the ship's officers took their daily sun sighting, using sextants to fix the Titanic's precise position on the chart. The results confirmed what everyone aboard already knew. The ship was making excellent time, and barring any unforeseen delays, she would reach New York on schedule. Captain Smith was pleased, and he dined that afternoon in the first-class dining saloon as a guest of the Widener family, George and Eleanor Widener, and their son Harry, who were hosting a small dinner party in the captain's honor. The conversation was lively and pleasant, touching on business and politics and the latest society gossip. And Captain Smith, who was known for his easy, avuncular manner, was in fine spirits. But behind the scenes, a different kind of information was arriving at the Titanic's wireless cabin. Throughout the day, the ship received a series of ice warnings from other vessels in the area, reports of icebergs and field ice lying directly in the Titanic's path. The first warning had arrived on the previous day, April the 13th, from the French liner La Touraine, which reported encountering ice at latitude 49 degrees north, longitude 26 degrees west. On the 14th itself, the warnings continued. The Baltic, a White Star Line ship traveling in the opposite direction, reported large icebergs at latitude 41 degrees 51 minutes north, longitude 49 degrees 9 minutes west, a position that lay almost exactly on the Titanic's projected course. The America, a German liner, sent a similar warning, reporting icebergs at a nearby location. These warnings were received by Jack Phillips, the senior wireless operator, who was laboring under a crushing workload of personal messages from first-class passengers. The wireless equipment had broken down the previous night, and Phillips and Bride had spent several hours repairing it, creating a backlog of outgoing messages that Phillips was still working to clear. The ice warnings were passed to the bridge, or at least some of them were, and Captain Smith acknowledged their receipt. But the evidence suggests that the full gravity of the situation was not appreciated by anyone in a position of authority aboard the ship. This failure of communication and attention would have devastating consequences. At approximately 1:40 in the afternoon, the Titanic received a detailed ice warning from the Baltic, which Captain Smith read, and then, inexplicably, handed to Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, who was traveling aboard as a passenger. Ismay glanced at the message, put it in his pocket, and showed it to several passengers during the afternoon, a strangely casual treatment of what was, in effect, a navigation hazard warning. He did not return the message to the bridge for several hours, and only then at the specific request of Captain Smith. Later that afternoon, the Titanic received another ice warning, this one from the Mesaba, which reported a large area of heavy pack ice and great icebergs directly ahead of the ship. This message was particularly significant because it described ice across a wide swath of ocean that the Titanic would be crossing within the next few hours. But the message never reached the bridge. Jack Phillips, still struggling to clear his backlog of personal messages, acknowledged the Mesaba's warning, but set it aside under his paperweight, intending to deliver it later. He never did, and so the Titanic continued at full speed into the darkness, 21.5 knots, her bow cutting through the black water with the confident inevitability of a train on its tracks. The decision not to slow down has been debated endlessly by historians and maritime experts, and the reasons for it are complex. It was, first of all, standard practice in 1912 for ships to maintain speed through ice fields, adjusting course only if ice was actually sighted directly ahead. The prevailing belief among experienced captains was that a lookout with good eyes could spot an iceberg in time for the ship to alter course and avoid it, and that slowing down would merely prolong the period of exposure to danger without significantly reducing the risk. Captain Smith was also under pressure, or at least perceived pressure, to arrive in New York on time. Bruce Ismay later denied having urged the captain to increase speed, but several passengers recalled conversations with Ismay in which he had spoken eagerly about the Titanic's performance and expressed hope that she might arrive ahead of schedule. Whether or not Ismay explicitly pressured Smith to maintain speed, the commercial imperative was clear. The White Star Line's reputation rested on the Titanic's maiden voyage being a success, and arriving late would not have been considered acceptable. As the afternoon wore on, and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. By evening, it had fallen to just above freezing, and the sea, which had been calm all day, became absolutely still, so flat and glassy that several passengers later described it as looking like a sheet of polished metal. This unusual calmness was, in fact, a dangerous condition. When the sea is rough, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg create a distinctive pattern of white water that can be seen even in darkness. But when the sea is perfectly calm, as it was on the night of April the 14th, icebergs present a dark, featureless profile that is almost impossible to detect against the black backdrop of the night sky. There was no moon. This was perhaps the single most consequential meteorological fact of the entire voyage. On a clear night with a bright moon, the lookouts in the crow's nest would almost certainly have seen the iceberg at a much greater distance, giving the ship time to alter course and avoid the collision. But on April the 14th, the moon had set hours earlier, and the sky, though brilliant with stars, offered no illumination of the sea surface. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were peering into an abyss of perfect darkness, searching for the faintest flicker of movement or reflection that might betray the presence of ice. They were also, crucially, without binoculars. The crow's nest had been equipped with binoculars for the voyage from Belfast to Southampton. But when the ship's crew was reorganized at Southampton, the binoculars had been locked in a cabinet by the previous second officer, David Blair, who had been reassigned at the last moment, and who had inadvertently taken the key with him when he left the ship, The replacement lookouts were told that there were no binoculars available, and they were expected to rely on their naked eyes alone. After the disaster, Frederick Fleet would testify before the British Board of Trade inquiry that if he had been given binoculars, he would have seen the iceberg soon enough to avoid it. We will never know whether this is true, but the absence of binoculars was certainly another link in the long chain of small failures and missed opportunities that led inexorably toward catastrophe. The evening passed quietly. In first class, dinner was served at the usual hour, a magnificent meal of 11 courses that included oysters, filet mignon, lamb with mint sauce, roast squab on cress, and a dessert course that featured Waldorf pudding and eclairs filled with French vanilla cream. The wine flowed freely, and the conversation sparkled under the electric chandeliers, and by the time coffee and liqueurs were served, the dining saloon was alive with the warm, contented hum of people who had eaten well and who had not a single reason to believe that anything was wrong. After dinner, many of the first-class passengers retired to the smoking room for brandy and cigars and a final round of cards. Others returned to their cabins, reading or writing letters or preparing for bed. The ship's orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley, played in the first-class lounge, filling the room with the soft, melodic strains of popular tunes and light classical pieces. Hartley was a serious musician who had given up a promising career in concert performance to work as a ship's bandmaster, and he took great pride in selecting repertoire that would enhance the refined, unhurried atmosphere of the voyage. In second class, the evening was quieter, but no less pleasant. Some passengers gathered in the smoking room for a game of cards, while others attended a hymn-singing session organized by one of the clergymen on board. The hymns were familiar favorites, and the singing was warm and sincere. A small community of strangers brought together by shared faith and the common experience of being far from home on a vast and lonely sea. In third class, the atmosphere was livelier, as it usually was. The general room was crowded with passengers who had gathered to dance and sing, accompanied by fiddles and accordion and the rhythmic clapping of hands. The mood was festive, even boisterous. The natural exuberance of people who were young and adventurous, and who had, for the first time in many of their lives, escaped the grinding poverty and limited horizons of the old world. On the bridge, the night watch had been set. First Officer Murdoch had taken over from Second Officer Lightoller at 10 o'clock, and the ship was running smoothly, maintaining her speed of 21.5 knots on a course that would take her directly through the ice field that lay ahead. Lightoller, before going off duty, had noted the unusual calmness of the sea and the absence of moonlight, and he had passed these observations on to Murdoch, along with instructions to keep a sharp lookout for ice. But neither Lightoller nor Murdoch ordered the ship to slow down, and neither suggested that additional lookouts be posted. In the wireless cabin, Jack Phillips was still at work, transmitting the backlog of personal messages that had accumulated during the equipment breakdown. At approximately 11 o'clock, the nearby steamer Californian, which had stopped for the night after encountering heavy ice, tried to send yet another warning. The Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, cut in on the frequency with the words, "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." Phillips, who was in the middle of transmitting a message to the wireless relay station at Cape Race, Newfoundland, was annoyed by the interruption and snapped back, "Shut up! Shut up! I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Evans, offended, listened for a few minutes longer, and then switched off his set and went to bed. It was approximately 11:35 in the evening. In less than 30 minutes, the Titanic would strike the iceberg, and the most powerful wireless set on the North Atlantic would begin sending frantic distress calls into the night. The Californian, less than 20 miles away, and possibly close enough to have reached the Titanic before she sank, would hear none of them. Her wireless was silent. Her operator was asleep. At 11:39, Lookout Frederick Fleet, peering into the darkness from the crow's nest high above the bow, saw something directly ahead of the ship. At first, it was just a shadow, a darkening of the darkness, a shape that was slightly denser and more solid than the surrounding night. But it was growing larger with terrible speed, and Fleet's stomach lurched as he realized what he was looking at. He reached for the bell rope and rang it 3 times, the signal for an object directly ahead, and then he grabbed the telephone and called the bridge. "What do you see?" asked 6th Officer James Moody, who answered the phone. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet replied. Moody immediately relayed the warning to 1st Officer Murdoch, who reacted with the speed of long experience. "Hard a starboard," he ordered the helmsman, Robert Hitchens, commanding a sharp turn to port. At the same time, Murdoch pulled the engine room telegraph to full Aston, ordering the engines to reverse. The great ship began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, her bow swinging to the left as the rudder bit into the water, and the reversed engines fought against the ship's enormous forward momentum. For a few breathless seconds, it seemed as though the Titanic might clear the iceberg entirely. The bow swung past the berg's protruding edge, missing it by what some observers later estimated as a matter of feet. But the iceberg was vast beneath the surface, much larger than the dark mass that was visible above the waterline. And as the Titanic's hull swept past, the underwater portion of the berg made contact with the ship's starboard side, scraping along the hull below the waterline with a sound that passengers would later describe in remarkably different ways. Some heard a faint grinding noise, like someone running a finger along the teeth of a comb. Others described a slight tremor, barely stronger than the normal vibration of the engines. Still others heard nothing at all, and felt only a gentle shudder, as if the ship had passed over a large wave or struck a submerged object of no particular consequence. In first class, where the passengers' cabins were insulated by layers of plush carpeting and heavy curtains and thick oak paneling, the impact was so subtle that many people slept through it entirely. In third class, closer to the waterline and to the point of impact, the sensation was somewhat stronger, and several passengers later recalled being jolted awake by a scraping, tearing sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the bowels of the ship. The entire collision lasted approximately 10 seconds. 10 seconds during which a jagged spur of ancient ice tore a series of gashes and punctures along the Titanic's starboard hull, opening her to the sea across a length of nearly 300 feet. The damage was not a single continuous gash, as is sometimes depicted in popular accounts, but rather a series of smaller openings, some no wider than a man's hand, where the rivets that held the hull plates together had been sheared away by the force of the impact, allowing the steel plates to buckle and separate just enough for the freezing Atlantic water to come pouring in. Within minutes, the first 5 of the Titanic's 16 watertight compartments were breached, and the North Atlantic began flooding into the ship at a rate of approximately 7 tons per second. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was summoned to inspect the damage, and what he found left him stunned. The Titanic had been designed to survive the flooding of any 4 of her forward compartments, but the iceberg had opened 5. And as the bow dipped under the weight of the incoming water, the sea would spill over the tops of the watertight bulkheads, which did not extend all the way to the ceiling, and flood the next compartment, and then the next, in a cascading sequence that could not be stopped or reversed. Andrews performed a rapid calculation and delivered his verdict to Captain Smith in words that must have fallen like hammer blows. The Titanic was going to sink. She had perhaps an hour, maybe 2 at the most, before the flooding overwhelmed her buoyancy, and she went down. And there were not enough lifeboats for everyone on board, not nearly enough. The mathematics of the disaster were stark and terrible. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, including 16 standard wooden lifeboats and 4 Engelhardt collapsible boats with canvas sides. Together, they had a total capacity of approximately 1,178 people, but the ship was carrying more than 2,200 passengers and crew. Even if every lifeboat was filled to its maximum capacity, more than 1,000 people would be left behind. And in the event, many of the lifeboats were launched only partially filled, a fact that would haunt the survivors and outrage the public in the weeks and months to come. Captain Smith, confronted with the terrible reality of the situation, ordered the lifeboats to be uncovered and prepared for launching. He ordered the wireless operators to begin sending distress signals, and he gave the order that would determine who lived and who died. Women and children first. The 2 hours and 40 minutes between the collision with the iceberg and the moment the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the North Atlantic were filled with scenes of such extraordinary human drama that they have haunted the world's imagination for more than a century. In those desperate, freezing, chaotic hours, the thin veneer of civilization that had governed life aboard the ship was stripped away, and the passengers and crew were confronted with the most fundamental of all human choices: how to face death, and the ways in which they answered that question, the acts of heroism and cowardice, of selflessness and selfishness, of love and fear and quiet, stubborn dignity, reveal something essential about the nature of the human spirit. The evacuation began slowly, almost reluctantly. Many passengers, roused from their cabins by stewards who knocked on doors and told them to put on their life belts and report to the boat deck, did not believe that the ship was in real danger. The Titanic was unsinkable, was she not? The idea that this enormous, solid, brilliantly lit vessel could actually be sinking seemed absurd. A bad joke, an overreaction by nervous officers who had been startled by a minor collision with a piece of ice. Some passengers put on their life belts as instructed, but then returned to their cabins to wait for further information. Others went to the boat deck, looked at the cold, dark sea far below, and decided that they preferred to stay aboard the warm, well-lit ship rather than climb into a small open boat and be lowered into the void. This reluctance was particularly strong among the first-class passengers, many of whom had absolute confidence in the ship's supposed indestructibility and who viewed the lifeboats with suspicion and even contempt. When Second Officer Lightoller, who was supervising the loading of the lifeboats on the port side of the ship, called for women and children to step forward, he was met with reluctance and resistance. Husbands did not want to be separated from their wives. Wives did not want to leave their husbands. Parents did not want to split up their families. And the lifeboats themselves, swinging on their davits high above the dark water, looked flimsy and unsafe compared to the massive, solid deck of the Titanic. As a result, the first lifeboats were launched with far fewer people than they could hold. Lifeboat number 7, the first to be lowered on the starboard side, left the ship carrying only about 28 people, despite having a capacity of 65. Lifeboat number 6, the first on the port side, was even more sparsely loaded, carrying only about 28 passengers, many of them women who had been practically forced into the boat by Lightoller and his crew. The officer's reasoning was simple, but, in the urgency of the moment, terribly flawed. He believed that the half-empty boats could return to the ship later to pick up additional passengers, or that they could be loaded further from the gangway doors on the lower decks. Neither of these plans was ever carried out. As the minutes passed, and the bow of the ship continued to settle deeper into the water, the reality of the situation became impossible to deny. The forward well deck, which had been dry and level an hour earlier, was now awash, and the sea was creeping steadily upward toward the bridge. The ship's lights, which had been burning brightly throughout, began to flicker, and a low, ominous groaning could be heard from deep within the hull, the sound of the ship's internal structure straining under forces it had never been designed to withstand. The mood on the boat deck shifted from skepticism to anxiety to something approaching panic, though even now, in these final desperate minutes, there were extraordinary acts of composure and courage that stand out against the darkness like stars. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who had been married for more than 40 years, arrived on the boat deck together. Ida was offered a place in one of the lifeboats, and Isidore was urged to join her, as his age and prominence might have made an exception to the women and children first rule possible. But Isidore refused. "I will not go before the other men," he said quietly, and he stepped back from the lifeboat. Ida, seeing her husband's decision, removed her fur coat, handed it to her maid, Ellen Bird, and turned back to Isidore. "We have lived together for many years," she told him. "Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on a pair of deck chairs on the boat deck, holding hands as the water rose around them. Their maid, Ellen Bird, wrapped in Ida's coat, survived in one of the lifeboats. Benjamin Guggenheim, upon learning that the ship was sinking and that there were not enough lifeboats for everyone, made a decision that was in keeping with his flamboyant personality and his sense of personal honor. He and his valet, Victor Giglio, retired to their cabin, removed their lifebelts, and changed into their finest evening clothes. Formal black tie, with white waistcoats and patent leather shoes. They returned to the boat deck, looking, as one survivor later described them, as if they were going to a dinner party. Guggenheim reportedly said, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He asked a steward to deliver a message to his wife. "Tell her I played the game out straight and to the end. No woman shall be left aboard this ship, because Ben Guggenheim was a coward." He and Giglio were last seen sitting in the smoking room, drinking brandy and waiting for the end. John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship, escorted his young wife Madeline to lifeboat number 4 and helped her climb in. He then asked Second Officer Lightoller if he might be allowed to join her, explaining that she was in a delicate condition, a Victorian euphemism for pregnancy. Lightoller refused. "No, sir," he said. "No men are allowed in these boats until all the women are loaded first." Astor stepped back without argument, lit a cigarette, and watched as the lifeboat was lowered to the water. He was last seen standing alone on the starboard side of the boat deck, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the dark sea. His body was recovered a week later, so badly crushed that it was believed he had been struck by the falling funnel. In his pocket was a gold watch, still ticking. Captain Smith's behavior during the final hours has been the subject of much debate and some controversy. Eyewitness accounts are contradictory, and it is difficult to construct a coherent narrative of his movements after the collision. What is clear is that he was deeply shaken by the magnitude of the disaster, and that his actions, while not negligent, lacked the decisive, commanding authority that the crisis demanded. He issued the order to send distress signals and to prepare the lifeboats, but he appeared to hesitate and equivocate at critical moments, perhaps overwhelmed by the knowledge that the ship he had been entrusted with was doomed, and that hundreds of people under his care were going to die. Some survivors recalled seeing Captain Smith on the bridge, staring silently into the darkness. Others reported seeing him walking among the passengers on the boat deck, megaphone in hand, shouting orders that were barely audible above the noise of the escaping steam. A few claimed to have seen him swimming in the water near the collapsible boats after the ship sank, though these accounts are unverified. What happened to Captain Smith in his final moments remains a mystery. His body was never recovered. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, spent his last hours in a state of anguished activity, moving through the ship, urging passengers to put on their lifebelts and make for the boat deck. He opened stateroom doors and personally escorted people to the lifeboats. He answered questions with honest gravity, confirming to those who asked that the ship was indeed sinking and that they must get off without delay. A steward named John Stewart later recalled seeing Andrews alone in the first-class smoking room in the final minutes, standing before the large painting of the port of Plymouth that hung above the fireplace, his lifebelt discarded on a nearby table, staring at the painting with an expression of such profound sorrow that Stewart could not bring himself to speak. Andrews had built the Titanic. She was his creation, his masterwork, and now he was watching her die. He went down with the ship. The scenes around the lifeboats were a study in the extremes of human behavior, under unimaginable stress. On the port side, Lightoller interpreted the women and children first order strictly, refusing to allow any men into the boats, even when there was room. On the starboard side, Murdoch took a more pragmatic approach, allowing men to board after all. Women and children in the immediate vicinity had been loaded. This difference in interpretation meant that a man's chances of survival depended in part on which side of the ship he happened to be standing on, a lottery of geography that would determine life or death. Some men found ways into the boats through cunning or desperation. A group of men reportedly rushed lifeboat number 14 as it was being loaded, and Fifth Officer Harold Lowe fired his pistol into the air to drive them back. Others dressed in women's clothing to deceive the officers, though the evidence for this is largely anecdotal and may have been exaggerated in the retelling. And some men simply jumped from the deck into boats that were already in the water, a dangerous gamble that succeeded for some and ended fatally for others. Among those who chose to stay behind were some of the most quietly heroic figures of the entire disaster. Father Thomas Biles, the Catholic priest who was traveling to New York for his brother's wedding, spent his final hours moving among the passengers, hearing confessions, offering absolution, and leading prayers. He was repeatedly offered a place in a lifeboat and repeatedly refused. Witnesses recalled seeing him standing near the stern of the ship as it tilted upward out of the water, a rosary in his hand, leading a group of passengers in the Lord's Prayer, and the Hail Mary as the deck beneath their feet grew steeper and the dark water climbed toward them. The engineers of the Titanic, led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, remained at their posts in the engine rooms throughout the entire crisis, maintaining the electrical power that kept the lights burning and the wireless transmitting until the very end. Not a single one of the Titanic's 35 engineers survived. They died in the darkness below, trapped in the flooding compartments. Their sacrifice, ensuring that the passengers on the decks above could see their way to the lifeboats, and that the wireless operators could continue sending their desperate calls for help. Wallace Hartley and his band of 7 musicians played throughout the sinking, providing a soundtrack to the catastrophe that has become one of the most enduring images of the Titanic disaster. They began playing in the first-class lounge shortly after the collision, performing ragtime tunes and popular melodies that were intended to calm the passengers and prevent panic. As the situation grew more desperate, they moved to the boat deck, where they continued to play in the open air, their instruments barely audible above the noise of the escaping steam, and the shouts of the officers, and the screams of the frightened passengers. What they played in those final minutes has been the subject of much debate. The most famous account, and the one that has entered the popular mythology of the Titanic, holds that the band's final piece was the hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." This account is supported by the testimony of several survivors, including wireless operator Harold Bride, who recalled hearing the hymn as he struggled in the water after the ship sank. But other survivors recalled different music, and some historians have suggested that the band may have played a waltz called Autumn or Songe d'automne. Whatever they played, the image of these 8 musicians standing on the sloping deck of the sinking ship, playing their instruments with calm professionalism, while chaos and death closed in around them, remains one of the most powerful and haunting images in the history of human courage. Hartley's body was recovered from the sea 10 days after the sinking. His violin case was strapped to his body, and inside was his violin, waterlogged but intact. He was buried in his hometown of Colne, Lancashire, and more than 1,000 mourners lined the streets for his funeral procession. His grave bears the inscription, carved in stone, of the opening bars of "Nearer, my God, to Thee." As the bow of the Titanic sank deeper and the stern rose higher, the final minutes became a scene of almost unimaginable horror. Hundreds of people who had been unable to find places in the lifeboat crowded toward the stern, which was now rising out of the water at an increasingly steep angle. The ship's lights, which had continued to burn throughout the sinking, flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the scene into darkness. Moments later, the Titanic's hull, subjected to stresses far beyond anything it had been designed to endure, broke in two between the 3rd and 4th funnels. The bow section, now completely flooded, tore away and plunged to the bottom of the ocean, dragging the stern section upright until it stood almost vertically, a towering black silhouette against the star-filled sky. For a few seconds, perhaps half a minute, the stern hung suspended, motionless, a horrifying sight that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. And then, slowly at first, then with gathering speed, it slid beneath the surface, carrying with it hundreds of people who were still clinging to the railings and the decks. The time was approximately 2:20 in the morning of April the 15th, 1912. The Titanic was gone. What followed was, by many accounts, even more terrible than the sinking itself. In the water, hundreds of people were struggling for their lives, thrashing and screaming in the 28-degree Fahrenheit water, their voices rising into the night in a sound that survivor Jack Thayer would later describe as a continuous wailing, a sound that he could never forget and that haunted him for the rest of his days. The water was so cold that it killed most of its victims within 15 to 30 minutes, not by drowning, but by hypothermia, the body's core temperature dropping so rapidly that the heart simply stopped. In the lifeboats, floating a few hundred yards away, the survivors listened to those screams with a mixture of horror, guilt, and helpless anguish. Many of them wanted to go back, to row toward the sound and try to pull people from the water, but they were overruled by others who feared that the swimmers would swamp the boats in their desperation, capsizing them and killing everyone. In the end, only one lifeboat returned to the scene. Lifeboat number 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who had the courage and the presence of mind to transfer his passengers to other boats and row back into the debris field to search for survivors. Lowe and his crew pulled 4 people alive from the water. 2 of them died shortly afterward. Hundreds more, their cries growing weaker as the cold claimed them, received no help at all. The sound faded gradually, diminishing from a roar to a murmur to a whisper, and then, at last, to silence. It took perhaps 20 minutes, and when it was over, the survivors in the lifeboats found themselves floating on a sea that was as quiet and as still as a graveyard, under a sky that blazed with more stars than most of them had ever seen, surrounded by the faint outlines of icebergs that drifted past like the ghosts of mountains. They waited. Some prayed. Some wept. Some sat in stunned, disbelieving silence, staring at the place where the Titanic had been and seeing only darkness and stars and the slow, indifferent movement of the sea. The cold was savage, penetrating their clothing and their skin and settling into their bones. And many of them believed that they too would die before help arrived. But help was coming. More than 50 miles to the southeast, the Cunard liner Carpathia, commanded by Captain Arthur Henry Rostron, had received the Titanic's distress signal and was racing toward the scene at full speed. Her engines pushed beyond their normal limits, her crew preparing for a rescue operation that would become one of the most celebrated acts of seamanship in maritime history. Rostron had cleared the ship's dining rooms and lounges to serve as dormitories for survivors. He had ordered hot coffee and soup to be prepared in vast quantities. He had stationed lookouts at every possible point to watch for ice, and he had charted a course that threaded through the ice field with extraordinary precision and nerve. The Carpathia arrived at the scene at approximately 4 in the morning, and the process of picking up the survivors began. One by one, the lifeboats rowed toward the rescue ship, and one by one, the frozen, Exhausted, grief-stricken passengers and crew were hauled aboard. Some climbed the rope ladders under their own power. Others, too weak or too injured to climb, were lifted aboard in slings and cargo nets. Children were brought up in canvas bags designed for mail sacks. And as they came aboard, the full scope of the tragedy began to reveal itself in the faces of the survivors, in the dazed, hollow-eyed expressions of men and women who had just witnessed and endured something that no amount of Edwardian composure could disguise. Of the approximately 2,208 people who had been aboard the Titanic when she struck the iceberg, only 710 survived. More than 1,500 had perished, making the sinking of the Titanic the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history up to that point, and one of the deadliest in all of human history. The news of the Titanic sinking broke upon the world like a thunderclap. In the early hours of April the 15th, fragmentary wireless messages began reaching shore stations on both sides of the Atlantic. Confused and contradictory reports that the great ship had struck an iceberg and was in distress. For several agonizing hours, no one on land knew the full extent of the disaster, and the information that filtered through was maddeningly incomplete. Some early reports suggested that the Titanic was damaged but still afloat, and that her passengers were being transferred to other ships. Others hinted at something far worse, but stopped short of confirming the unthinkable. In New York, where the Titanic had been expected to arrive on Wednesday morning, the offices of the White Star Line at 9 Broadway were besieged by anxious friends and family members demanding information. The crowds grew throughout the day, spilling out onto the street and blocking traffic, their faces reflecting the terrible uncertainty of waiting for news that might confirm their worst fears. Inside, the company's representatives knew almost nothing more than the people outside, and they issued a series of statements that ranged from cautiously optimistic to deliberately misleading, assuring the public that the Titanic was unsinkable and that all passengers were safe. It was not until the evening of April the 15th, more than 18 hours after the ship had gone down, that the full truth began to emerge. The Carpathia, steaming toward New York with the survivors, had been maintaining wireless silence to conserve her limited communication capacity for official messages and the personal telegrams of the survivors. And the resulting information vacuum was filled with rumor, speculation, and outright fabrication. Some newspapers reported that the Titanic was being towed to Halifax by other ships. Others published passenger lists that bore no relationship to reality. And at the White Star Line offices, the walls were lined with bulletin boards that were covered with handwritten names. Lists of the saved and the lost that were constantly being revised and updated as new information arrived by wire. When the truth finally became clear, the reaction was one of almost universal shock and grief. The sinking of the Titanic was not merely a maritime disaster, but a blow to the very foundations of the Edwardian worldview, a devastating refutation of the belief that human technology had conquered nature, and that progress was an unstoppable force for good. The ship that could not sink had sunk. The age that believed it had mastered the sea had been humbled by an iceberg, and the human cost of that humbling was measured not in abstract statistics, but in the specific, individual, irreplaceable lives of more than 1,500 men, women, and children, whose names and faces and stories would now become part of the permanent record of human loss. The Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of Thursday, April the 18th, docking at Pier 54 on the Hudson River in a cold, driving rain. More than 30,000 people had gathered at the waterfront to witness her arrival, and the scene was one of extraordinary emotional intensity. As the survivors descended the gangways, they were met by weeping family members, by reporters shouting questions, by photographers' flashbulbs exploding in the darkness, and by the simple, overwhelming reality that they had survived something that most people could not even begin to comprehend. The public reaction to the disaster was swift and fierce, and it quickly focused on the question of blame. Who was responsible for the deaths of more than 1,500 people? Was it Captain Smith for maintaining speed through known ice fields? Was it Bruce Ismay for pressuring the captain and for the perceived inadequacy of the lifeboat provision? Was it the White Star Line for building a ship with too few lifeboats? Was it the Board of Trade, whose outdated regulations had permitted the Titanic to sail with lifeboat capacity for only about half her passengers and crew? Or was it something larger and more diffuse, a systemic failure of judgment and imagination that had its roots in the overconfidence of an entire civilization? 2 official inquiries were convened to investigate the disaster. The first, conducted by the United States Senate and chaired by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, began on April the 19th, just 1 day after the Carpathia's arrival in New York, and lasted for 18 days. The second, conducted by the British Board of Trade under the direction of Lord Mersey, began on May the 2nd and lasted for 36 days. Together, these 2 inquiries examined more than 100 witnesses, including surviving officers, crew members, passengers, and expert witnesses from the fields of naval architecture, wireless communication, and maritime law. The testimony was often riveting, sometimes contradictory, and occasionally devastating. Bruce Ismay, who had survived the sinking by climbing into one of the last lifeboats on the starboard side, was subjected to particularly harsh questioning. Senator Smith pressed him on whether he had influenced Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed, whether he had been aware of the ice warnings, and whether his own escape from the ship had been honorable, given that so many others, including many women and children, had perished. Ismay denied any wrongdoing, insisting that he had boarded the lifeboat only after all women and children in the immediate area had been accommodated, and that the boat was about to be lowered with empty seats. But the damage to his reputation was irreparable. The press, particularly the newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst, branded him J. Brute Ismay and the coward of the Titanic, and he spent the remaining 25 years of his life in a state of virtual seclusion, haunted by the disaster and by the public contempt that followed it. Second Officer Lightoller, the most senior surviving officer, proved to be a more skillful witness, deflecting criticism with a combination of charm, evasiveness, and strategic memory loss that frustrated the investigators, but protected both his own reputation and that of the White Star Line. Lightoller was a company man, loyal to his employers and to the memory of Captain Smith, and he was determined to prevent the inquiries from laying blame at the feet of the officers and crew who had done their best in an impossible situation. The findings of both inquiries were broadly similar. They concluded that the Titanic had been traveling too fast in an area known to contain ice, that the number of lifeboats was woefully inadequate, that the lifeboat drill and evacuation procedures had been poorly organized and inconsistently applied, and that the nearby steamer Californian could and should have come to the Titanic's assistance. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, was singled out for particularly harsh criticism, and his reputation was destroyed, fairly or unfairly, by the finding that his ship had been close enough to see the Titanic's distress rockets, but had failed to respond. The most important consequence of the inquiries was a sweeping reform of maritime safety regulations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, was convened in London in 1913 and produced a set of new rules that would transform ocean travel forever. The most significant of these was the requirement that every ship carry enough lifeboats for every person on board, a provision so obvious and so fundamental that it seems almost incredible that it had not been in place before the Titanic disaster. Other reforms included the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, a service operated by the United States Coast Guard that tracks icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes and warns vessels of their presence. The requirement that ships maintain a continuous wireless watch so that distress signals would never again go unheard because the wireless operator had gone to bed, and the standardization of distress signal procedures, including the use of rockets and the newly adopted SOS signal. These reforms saved countless lives in the decades that followed, and they continue to form the foundation of maritime safety regulation to this day. In that sense, the 1,500 people who died aboard the Titanic did not die in vain. Their deaths, terrible and unnecessary as they were, forced a complacent world to confront the limitations of its own technology and the inadequacy of its safety provisions. And the result was a revolution in maritime law that made ocean travel immeasurably safer for every passenger who came after them. But the legacy of the Titanic extends far beyond the realm of maritime regulation. The disaster left an indelible mark on the culture and consciousness of the Western world, a scar that has never fully healed and that continues to fascinate, horrify, and move us more than a century after the event. The Titanic has inspired hundreds of books, dozens of films, countless songs, and a permanent museum exhibition that attracts millions of visitors every year. She has become a metaphor for hubris, for the consequences of overconfidence, for the collision between human ambition and the indifferent power of nature. And yet, for all the cultural significance that has been layered upon the story over the decades, the emotional core of the Titanic disaster remains intensely personal. It is not the ship herself that moves us, magnificent as she was. It is the people. It is Isidore and Ida Strauss, sitting together on the deck as the water rose. It is Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in his evening clothes, waiting for the end with a glass of brandy in his hand. It is Wallace Hartley, playing his violin as the deck tilted beneath his feet. It is the mother in steerage who held her children close and whispered prayers in a language that no one around her could understand. It is the stoker who stayed at his post in the boiler room, feeding coal into the furnaces so that the lights would keep burning. It is the wireless operator who kept tapping out his distress calls until the water reached the wireless cabin door. These are the stories that endure, the human moments that give the Titanic disaster its extraordinary emotional power. And they endure because they speak to something universal in the human experience, to the questions that every person must eventually confront. How would I behave in such a crisis? Would I be brave or afraid? Would I sacrifice myself for others or fight for my own survival? Would I face the end with dignity or with despair? The passengers and crew of the Titanic answered these questions in 1,000 different ways, and their answers form a mosaic of human nature that is as complex and as contradictory as humanity itself. There were heroes and cowards, saints and sinners, men who gave their lives for strangers, and men who pushed women aside to save themselves. And in the end, the thing that makes the Titanic story so endlessly compelling is not that it shows us the best of human nature, or the worst, but that it shows us both, intertwined and inseparable, the full spectrum of what it means to be human in the face of mortality. There are stories within the Titanic story that have been told so many times that they have taken on the polished quality of legend, their edges smoothed by repetition until they seem almost too perfect, too symmetrical, too dramatically satisfying to be entirely true. And then there are the stories that have been largely forgotten, the smaller, quieter, less spectacular tales of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. And it is these stories, perhaps more than the grand dramas of the Astors and the Guggenheims, that reveal the full human complexity of the disaster. Consider, for example, the story of the Allison family. Hudson Joshua Creighton. Allison was a wealthy Canadian businessman, 30 years old, who was traveling in first class with his wife, Bessie, their 2-year-old daughter, Lorraine, and their 11-month-old son, Trevor. They were accompanied by 4 servants, including a nursemaid named Alice Cleaver, who had been hired to care for the children. When the ship began to sink, Alice Cleaver took the baby, Trevor, and boarded lifeboat number 11 without informing the Allisons of what she had done. Hudson and Bessie, frantic with worry over their missing son, refused to board a lifeboat until they found him. They searched the ship desperately, moving from deck to deck, cabin to cabin, calling his name into the chaos and confusion. They never found him, and they never left the ship. Hudson, Bessie, and little Lorraine all perished. Trevor, safe in Alice Cleaver's arms aboard Lifeboat 11, survived. He was returned to the Allison family in Montreal, and he grew up to live a long life, never knowing the parents and sister who had died searching for him. The story of the Allison family is a study in the terrible role that chance and miscommunication played in determining who lived and who died on the Titanic. If Alice Cleaver had told the Allisons that she was taking Trevor to a lifeboat, they might have boarded as well, and the entire family might have survived. But in the noise and confusion and fear of the evacuation, that simple message was never delivered, and the consequences were irreversible and devastating. There is also the remarkable story of Charles Juin, the chief baker aboard the Titanic, whose survival has baffled historians and scientists for decades. Juin was a stout, cheerful man who took his responsibilities seriously, and when the order came to prepare the lifeboats, he organized his team of bakers to carry bread and provisions to the boats on the upper deck. He helped load women and children into the lifeboats, at one point physically throwing reluctant passengers into the boats when they hesitated. And then, as the ship began her final plunge, Jochen climbed to the very stern, the highest point of the rapidly tilting ship, and rode it down into the water like a man riding an elevator, stepping off into the sea at the last possible moment, with barely more than the top of his head getting wet. What makes Jochen's story extraordinary is what happened next. By all the known science of cold water immersion, Jochen should have died within minutes. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, well below freezing, cold enough to kill most people in 15 to 30 minutes. But Dugin survived in the water for more than 2 hours, treading water and paddling slowly through the darkness, until he reached the overturned, collapsible lifeboat B, where he was able to hold onto the edge and stay afloat until rescued by the Carpathia. When asked how he had managed to survive so long in water that had killed hundreds of others, Dugin attributed his good fortune to the large quantity of whiskey he had consumed during the sinking. Medical experts have since debated whether alcohol could genuinely have protected him from hypothermia, and the consensus is that it almost certainly did not, as alcohol actually accelerates heat loss by dilating blood vessels near the surface of the skin. The true explanation for Jofin's survival remains a mystery, one of the many small puzzles that the Titanic has left behind for us to ponder. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, played a role in the Titanic disaster that extended far beyond the simple transmission and reception of messages. In many ways, they were the link between the doomed ship and the outside world, the sole means by which the Titanic's plight could be communicated to other vessels and to the shore. And their behavior during the crisis, particularly that of Phillips, who was just 25 years old, was a display of professional dedication and personal courage that ranks among the most admirable of the entire disaster. When Captain Smith informed Phillips and Bride that the ship was sinking and ordered them to send the distress call, Phillips immediately began transmitting CQD, the standard distress signal of the era. Bride, who had been sleeping when the collision occurred, joined him at the wireless desk, and together they sent a continuous stream of distress messages, providing the Titanic's position and the nature of the emergency to any ship that could hear them. It was Bride who suggested, with characteristic humor, that Phillips try the new SOS signal as well, joking that it might be his last chance to use it. Phillips did so, and the Titanic became one of the first ships in history to send an SOS, a signal that would soon replace CQD as the universal distress call. For nearly 2 hours, Phillips sat at his desk, tapping out the distress calls with steady hands, while the ship sank around him. The wireless cabin, located on the boat deck, was one of the last parts of the ship to be submerged, and Phillips continued transmitting until the very end, even after Captain Smith came to the cabin and told the operators that they had done their duty and were free to save themselves. Phillips reportedly nodded and continued working, his fingers moving with the same precise, mechanical rhythm that they had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. In the final minutes, as the water began to flood the wireless cabin, a stoker from the engine rooms, half crazed with fear and cold, tried to steal Phillips's lifebelt. Bride later testified that he and Phillips struggled with the man and that Bride knocked him unconscious, though other accounts suggest that the altercation was less violent than Bride's testimony implied. What is certain is that Phillips died that night. He managed to reach the overturned collapsible B, the same one to which Joan had clung, but he was too exhausted and too cold to survive, and he died sometime before dawn. He was 25 years old, and his body was never recovered. Bride survived, though he was severely frostbitten and had to be carried off the Carpathia on a stretcher. He later gave testimony to both the American and British inquiries that was invaluable in reconstructing the timeline of the disaster, and his account of the night, delivered in a calm, understated manner that belied the horror of what he had experienced, remains one of the most important eyewitness testimonies in the historical record. The role of class in determining survival aboard the Titanic is one of the most troubling and most thoroughly documented aspects of the disaster. The statistics tell a story of inequality so stark that it is difficult to read them without a sense of outrage, even at a distance of more than a century. In first class, 62% of passengers survived. In second class, the figure was 41%. In third class, it was only 25%. Among the crew, 24% survived. And when the numbers are broken down further, the disparities become even more pronounced. 97% of first-class women survived, compared to 86% of second-class women and 46% of third-class women. Among children, all first-class children survived, all second-class children survived, but only 34% of third-class children survived. These numbers reflect a series of factors, some deliberate and some accidental, that combine to give first-class passengers a vastly better chance of survival than their counterparts in the lower classes. First-class cabins were located on the upper decks, close to the lifeboats. First-class passengers were alerted to the danger earlier and more efficiently by the first-class stewards, who were better organized and more attentive than their counterparts in the lower decks. And first-class passengers, by virtue of their position on the ship and their social status, had easier access to the boat deck and to the officers who were supervising the evacuation. Third-class passengers, by contrast, faced a series of obstacles that dramatically reduced their chances of reaching the lifeboats in time. Their cabins were located deep in the ship, far from the boat deck, connected by a labyrinth of corridors and staircases that were confusing even in normal circumstances, and that became almost impassable in the chaos of the evacuation. The gates that separated third class from the upper decks were, according to some accounts, locked or blocked, though the evidence on this point is contested. Some survivors testified that they were held back by crew members who refused to open the gates, while others recalled being allowed through without difficulty. What is clear is that the physical layout of the ship, combined with the social conventions of the era, created a situation in which third-class passengers were systematically disadvantaged in the struggle for survival. The question of whether the third-class passengers were deliberately sacrificed to save the wealthy has been debated by historians for more than a century. The most extreme version of this claim, popularized by certain films and novels, holds that the White Star Line and its officers consciously chose to save first-class passengers at the expense of those in steerage, locking the gates and posting guards to prevent the poor from reaching the lifeboats. The historical evidence does not fully support this dramatic narrative. It is true that the gates existed, and it is true that some third-class passengers were delayed in reaching the boat deck, but it is also true that the evacuation was chaotic and disorganized, that communication between different parts of the ship was poor, and that the officers supervising the lifeboats were often unaware of conditions in the lower decks. The more nuanced and probably more accurate explanation is that the class divisions built into the ship's physical structure, combined with the general confusion and lack of clear leadership during the evacuation, created a situation in which third-class passengers were left largely to fend for themselves. They were not deliberately abandoned, but neither were they given the same level of attention and assistance as the passengers in the upper classes. And in a crisis where minutes could mean the difference between life and death, that disparity of attention was enough to condemn hundreds of people to a freezing death in the North Atlantic. One of the most persistent and most fascinating aspects of the Titanic story is the mythology that has grown up around it. The legends and half-truths and outright fabrications that have become so deeply embedded in the popular imagination that they are often mistaken for historical fact. Some of these myths are relatively harmless, such as the widely held belief that the Titanic was christened with a bottle of champagne at her launch. She was not. The White Star Line did not practice the tradition of christening their ships, and the Titanic slid into the waters of Belfast Lough on May the 31st, 1911, without ceremony or fanfare, accompanied only by the cheers of the shipyard workers who had built her and the blast of a steam whistle to warn the small boats in the harbour to clear the way. Other myths are more consequential and more difficult to dislodge. The most famous of these is the claim that the Titanic was declared unsinkable by her builders or owners, a statement that is sometimes attributed to Captain Smith himself. In fact, as we have already seen, the word unsinkable was used by a trade publication, qualified by the adverb practically, and it appears to have been adopted by the press and the public without the official endorsement of either the White Star Line or Harland and Wolff. After the disaster, the company went to considerable lengths to distance itself from the claim, and there is no documented instance of any representative of the White Star Line using the word unsinkable in an official context before the sinking. Another enduring myth concerns the ship's last moments. The popular image of the Titanic sinking in one piece, her stern rising majestically out of the water before sliding beneath the surface at a steep angle, was long considered the definitive account of the ship's final plunge. This version was supported by the testimony of many survivors, including Second Officer Lightoller, who insisted that the ship had gone down intact. But when the wreck was discovered on the ocean floor in 1985 by a joint American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel, it was found to be in two pieces, the bow and stern sections lying approximately 2,000 feet apart on the seabed, confirming the accounts of those survivors who had reported seeing the ship break in two. The discovery of the wreck not only resolved this long-standing debate, but also provided a wealth of new information about the ship's construction, the nature of the damage caused by the iceberg, and the process by which the ship had sunk. The wreck itself, lying at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic, has become one of the most studied and most visited shipwrecks in history. Since its discovery, more than a dozen expeditions have visited the site, using deep-sea submersibles and remotely operated vehicles to photograph, film, and examine the remains. What they have found is a scene of eerie, ghostly beauty. The great ship lying in two pieces on a flat, muddy plain, her bow section remarkably intact, and her stern section badly damaged by the impact with the ocean floor. The debris field between the two sections is strewn with thousands of artifacts, from personal belongings like shoes, eyeglasses, and pieces of luggage, to larger items like sections of the ship's hull plating, deck fittings, and even one of the ship's enormous boilers. The discovery of the wreck also reignited the debate about whether the Titanic should be treated as a gravesite and left undisturbed, or whether artifacts should be recovered and preserved for historical study and public exhibition. Over the years, several thousand artifacts have been recovered from the debris field by the salvage company RMS Titanic, Incorporated, which was granted exclusive salvage rights by a United States federal court. These artifacts have been displayed in traveling exhibitions around the world, and they include personal items that bring the human story of the disaster into sharp, poignant focus. A leather bag containing jewelry and banknotes, a child's marble, a pair of gloves, a set of keys, a postcard that was never sent. The ethical questions raised by the recovery of these artifacts are genuinely difficult. On the one hand, the items provide an invaluable link to the past, allowing us to see and touch the actual objects that were held and used and cherished by the people who sailed aboard the Titanic. On the other hand, they were recovered from a site where more than 1,500 people died, a place that many survivors and their descendants consider to be sacred ground. The debate continues, and it is unlikely to be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. But it serves as a reminder that the Titanic story is not merely history, but a living, evolving narrative that continues to provoke strong emotions and difficult questions. Among the lesser-known stories of the Titanic are those of the crew members whose courage and sacrifice received little public recognition in the aftermath of the disaster. The ship's postal workers, for example, 5 men who were responsible for sorting and guarding the mail stored in the ship's post office on G deck, attempted to save the mail sacks when the lower decks began to flood. They dragged hundreds of sacks of mail up the companionways to higher ground, working in rising water that eventually reached their waists in a futile effort to preserve the letters and packages that had been entrusted to their care. All 5 postal workers, Oscar Woody, John March, William Gwynn, Jago Smith, and John Starr March, perished in the sinking. Their bodies were never recovered. There was also the story of the Titanic's victualling crew, the stewards, stewardesses, cooks, bakers, and other service staff who made up the largest single group of crew members aboard. Many of these men and women displayed extraordinary courage during the evacuation, guiding passengers to the lifeboats, distributing lifebelts, carrying children up the staircases, and in many cases, deliberately stepping back from the lifeboats to allow passengers to board. The stewardesses were among the unsung heroines of the disaster. Women like Violet Jessop, a 24-year-old Irish woman who had already survived the collision between the Olympic and the HMS Hawke in 1911, and who would go on to survive the sinking of the Britannic in 1916, earning her the nickname Miss Unsinkable. Jessop was ordered into Lifeboat 16 and handed a baby to hold during the long, cold hours on the water. When the Carpathia arrived, a woman rushed forward, snatched the baby from Jessop's arms, and disappeared into the crowd without a word of thanks. Jessop never learned the identity of the baby or its mother. The story of the Titanic's 8 musicians is one that has been told many times, but it bears retelling in this context because it illustrates, perhaps more powerfully than any other single episode, the extraordinary range of human responses to the approach of death. The musicians were not employees of the White Star Line, but independent contractors employed by a Liverpool talent agency. They were paid modest wages, and they received no special training in emergency procedures. When the ship began to sink, they had no obligation to do anything other than save themselves. And yet, they chose to play, to stand on the sloping deck of a dying ship and fill the night air with music, while all around them people were screaming and praying and fighting for their lives. Why did they do it? We will never know for certain, because none of them survived to explain their decision. But the most likely explanation is the simplest one. They were musicians, and playing was what they knew how to do. In a situation of unimaginable chaos and terror, they did the one thing that gave them a sense of purpose and control, the one thing that allowed them to impose a measure of order on a world that had been shattered beyond repair. And in doing so, they provided comfort to others. A small island of beauty and normalcy in a sea of horror, and they achieved a kind of immortality that few musicians in history have ever known. The band consisted of Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster, who played violin, John Law Hume, a Scottish violinist, George Crins, a Belgian violinist, Percy Cornelius Taylor, a cellist, W. Theodore Ronald Brayley, a pianist, John Frederick Preston Clark, a bass violin player, John Wesley Woodward, a cellist, and Roger Marie Brissot, a French cellist. Their average age was 25. Most of them were single. Several had been planning to leave the sea and pursue other careers after the Titanic's return voyage. None of them had any reason to believe, when they packed their instruments and boarded the ship at Southampton, that they were embarking on their final performance. The aftermath of the disaster was marked not only by grief and outrage, but by a series of bitter legal disputes that revealed the less elevated aspects of human nature. The White Star Line, seeking to limit its financial liability, filed a petition in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, arguing that the company should not be held responsible for losses that exceeded the value of the recovered lifeboats and salvageable cargo. The company initially offered a total of $97,772.05 to cover all claims from all passengers and crew, an amount that was breathtakingly inadequate given the wealth of some of the passengers who had perished and the profound losses suffered by all of the survivors. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, and when they were finally settled in 1916, the White Star Line agreed to pay $664,000 in damages, a sum that was less than a quarter of the amount claimed. The settlement was widely criticized as grossly insufficient, and it left many of the survivors and their families feeling that they had been victimized twice, first by the disaster itself, and then by a legal system that seemed to value corporate interests above human suffering. The emotional and psychological toll of the disaster on the survivors was immense, and it persisted for decades. Many survivors suffered from what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, depression, and a persistent sense of guilt at having survived when so many others had perished. Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old first-class passenger who had survived by jumping into the water and clinging to the overturned, collapsible B, was haunted by the memory of the sinking for the rest of his life. He wrote a short memoir of his experience, privately published in 1940, but the psychological wounds never fully healed. In 1945, following the death of his mother and the loss of his son in the Second World War, Thayer took his own life. He was 50 years old. Milvina Dean, who was the youngest passenger aboard the Titanic at just 9 weeks old, became the last living survivor of the disaster, a distinction she held until her death on May the 31st, 2009, at the age of 97. Dean had no personal memories of the Titanic, of course, but the disaster shaped her entire life, beginning with the death of her father, Bertram, who had been traveling with his family to Wichita, Kansas, where he planned to open a tobacco shop. Bertram Dean was lost in the sinking, and his wife, Eva, unable to face the prospect of starting a new life in America without him, returned to England with her 2 children. Milvina grew up in Southampton, the city from which the Titanic had sailed, and she spent much of her later life attending Titanic commemorations and speaking to the press about a disaster she could not remember, but from which she could never entirely escape. The children of the Titanic occupy a particularly poignant place in the story, not only because of their vulnerability and innocence, but because their fates were so dramatically determined by the class in which they travelled. The contrast between the survival rates of children in different classes is one of the most disturbing statistics of the disaster. Every child in first class survived. Every child in second class survived. But of the 79 children travelling in third class, only 27 survived. 52 third-class children, some of them infants, perished in the sinking. A number that reflects the structural inequalities that made the Titanic not merely a ship, but a microcosm of the rigidly stratified society that had created her. Among the children who survived were the Navratil brothers, Michel Jr. and Edmund, the 2 French toddlers whose father had kidnapped them and boarded the ship under an assumed name. When the ship struck the iceberg, Michel Navratil Sr. wrapped his sons in blankets, carried them to the boat deck, and placed them in Collapsible D, one of the last lifeboats to be launched. He then stepped back and went down with the ship. The boys, too young to tell anyone their names or where they were from, were taken aboard the Carpathia and cared for by first-class passenger Margaret Hayes, who spoke French and who provided for them until their mother, Marcel, crossed the Atlantic to claim them. Michel Jr., who was 3 years old at the time of the sinking, would live until 2001, dying at the age of 92 as one of the last surviving passengers, with actual memories of the disaster. The story of the Titanic also intersected with the broader social and political movements of the early 20th century in ways that were not always immediately apparent. The disaster occurred at a moment when the women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum in both Britain and America, and the debate over the Women and Children First protocol became, for some, a proxy for larger arguments about gender equality and the proper roles of men and women in society. Some suffragists argued that the protocol was patronizing and that women should have the right to make their own decisions about whether to board the lifeboats. Others pointed out that the protocol, whatever its ideological implications, had saved hundreds of women's lives and that its enforcement had been selective and inconsistent, with wealthy women far more likely to benefit from it than poor ones. The labor movement also found in the Titanic disaster a powerful illustration of the inequalities that it was fighting to overcome. The fact that the survival rate among first-class passengers was more than twice that of third-class passengers provided dramatic evidence of the ways in which wealth and social status could determine not only the quality of life, but the very possibility of survival. Union leaders and socialist politicians pointed to the Titanic as proof that the existing social order valued the lives of the rich above the lives of the poor, and they used the disaster to argue for reforms in labor law, immigration policy, and workplace safety. The Titanic's impact on popular culture has been vast and enduring, and it shows no signs of diminishing. The disaster has been the subject of hundreds of books, ranging from scholarly histories and technical analyses to novels, poems, and children's stories. It has been depicted in more than a dozen films, beginning with a silent movie released in 1912, just a month after the sinking, and continuing through the James Cameron blockbuster of 1997, which became the highest-grossing film in history at the time of its release, and which introduced the Titanic story to a new generation of viewers. The cultural fascination with the Titanic is, at its root, a fascination with mortality, with a confrontation between human aspiration and human limitation, between the things we build and the forces that can destroy them. The Titanic was the supreme achievement of an age that believed in the power of technology to overcome nature, and her destruction was a reminder, delivered with devastating clarity, that nature is not so easily overcome. She was a ship, but she was also a symbol, an embodiment of the hope and the hubris of the early 20th century. And her story continues to resonate because those qualities, hope and hubris, are as much a part of the human condition today as they were in 1912. The story of the Californian, the ship that lay somewhere between 10 and 20 miles from the Titanic on the night of the disaster, remains one of the most controversial and most debated aspects of the entire Titanic narrative. The Californian was a leyland line steamship, much smaller than the Titanic, and she had stopped for the night after encountering heavy field ice that her captain, Stanley Lord, judged too dangerous to navigate in the dark. Lord's decision to stop was, by the standards of the day, eminently sensible and prudent, a cautionary approach that contrasted sharply with Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed through the same ice field. But what happened aboard the Californian after the Titanic struck the iceberg has generated more than a century of bitter argument and recrimination. The essential facts are these. Sometime around midnight, officers on the Californian observed a large ship to the south-southeast, approximately 5 to 10 miles away. They watched the ship's lights and noted that she appeared to be stationary. At approximately 12:45 in the morning, they saw what appeared to be rockets being fired from the direction of the ship. White rockets that burst at a great height and then fell slowly back to the horizon. Second Officer Herbert Stone and apprentice James Gibson watched a total of 8 rockets over the course of about an hour. They reported the rockets to Captain Lord, who was resting in the chart room, and Lord asked whether the rockets were company signals, a form of identification used by some shipping lines. Stone replied that they did not appear to be company signals, as they were white and fired at regular intervals. Lord suggested that they try to contact the ship by Morse lamp. Stone and Gibson flashed the lamp repeatedly, but the distant ship did not respond. And then, gradually, the ship's lights seemed to move away and eventually disappeared. Lord later testified that he believed the rockets were company signals and that the ship was not in distress. He maintained this position for the rest of his life, insisting that the ship he had seen was not the Titanic, but some smaller vessel that lay between the Californian and the sinking liner. But the weight of the evidence, as assessed by both the American and British inquiries, was overwhelmingly against him. The inquiries concluded that the ship seen by the Californian's officers was almost certainly the Titanic, that the rockets were distress signals, and that Lord had failed in his duty to respond to a ship in mortal danger. The question of what might have happened if Lord had acted differently is one of the great what-ifs of the Titanic story. If the Californian had responded immediately to the first rocket, steamed toward the distress signals, and arrived at the scene while the Titanic was still afloat, could she have saved some or all of the passengers who were left behind when the lifeboats were launched? The answer is far from certain. The Californian was a much smaller ship, with limited passenger capacity, and navigating through an ice field in the dark was a genuinely dangerous undertaking. But even if she had arrived too late to take passengers directly off the Titanic, her presence might have encouraged more of the lifeboats to return to the scene of the sinking and pick up swimmers from the water, potentially saving hundreds of additional lives. Captain Lord was never officially censured or punished for his inaction, but his career was effectively destroyed, and he spent the remaining decades of his life attempting to clear his name. He died in 1962, still protesting his innocence, and the debate about his responsibility continues to this day. In 1992, the British Marine Accident Investigation Branch conducted a new assessment of the evidence and concluded that the ship seen by the Californian was indeed the Titanic, but that the distance between the two ships was greater than the original inquiries had estimated, perhaps as much as 18 miles rather than the 5 to 10 miles originally assumed. This finding somewhat mitigated Lord's culpability, as it suggested that reaching the Titanic in time would have been more difficult than previously believed, but it did not absolve him of the fundamental failure to respond to what were clearly distress signals from a ship in trouble. The story of the Titanic's lifeboats is itself a tale of striking contrast, a miniature drama within the larger catastrophe that reveals the full range of human behavior under extreme stress. Some lifeboats were commanded with skill and compassion by officers and crew members who managed to maintain discipline and order in impossible circumstances. Others were scenes of confusion, fear, and bitter recrimination, floating islands of misery where the trauma of the sinking was compounded by the cold, the darkness, and the agonizing awareness that hundreds of people were dying in the water nearby. Lifeboat number 1, one of the emergency cutters, became notorious as the Millionaires boat. It was launched from the starboard side, carrying only 12 people, despite having a capacity of 40. Among its occupants were Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, a wealthy Scottish landowner, and his wife, Lady Lucy Duff Gordon, a famous fashion designer who operated under the business name Lucille. The Duff Gordons were accompanied by Lady Duff Gordon's secretary, Laura Francatelli, and the remainder of the boat's occupants were crew members. The boat did not return to pick up swimmers after the Titanic sank, and Sir Cosmo was later accused of having bribed the crew to row away from the sinking ship, a charge he denied, but which clung to his reputation for the rest of his life. He testified at the British inquiry that he had offered the crew members £5 each to replace the kit they had lost in the sinking, a gift that he insisted was motivated by generosity rather than guilt. The inquiry accepted his explanation, but the public was not so forgiving, and the Duff Gordons became symbols of the selfishness and callousness that many people believed had characterized the behavior of the wealthy during the disaster. By contrast, lifeboat number 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, became a symbol of courage and determination. Lowe was a 28-year-old Welshman with a fiery temper and a deep sense of duty, and he was one of the few officers who took decisive action to save people from the water after the Titanic sank. When the ship went down, Lowe gathered several of the nearby lifeboats together, redistributed their passengers to free up space, and then rowed number 14 back into the field of debris and bodies that marked the spot where the Titanic had disappeared. He pulled 4 people alive from the water, 3 men and a woman, though 2 of the men died shortly afterward from exposure. Lowe's decision to go back was not without risk, as there was a real danger that desperate swimmers might capsize the lifeboat in their efforts to climb aboard. But he managed the situation with skill and firmness, and his actions saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The experience of the survivors in the lifeboats during the 4-hour wait for the Carpathia was one of intense physical suffering and psychological torment. The air temperature was well below freezing, and many of the passengers had left the ship wearing only night clothes, without coats or blankets or any protection against the bitter cold. Some of the women had given their wraps and furs to others, leaving themselves exposed to the elements. Others huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in a desperate attempt to stave off hypothermia. The sea was perfectly calm, which was a blessing in that it prevented the small boats from capsizing. But the lack of wind and waves also meant that there was no insulation between the passengers and the freezing air, which settled over them like a blanket of ice. In some boats, the occupants sang hymns to keep their spirits up, their voices rising thin and wavering into the darkness. In others, they prayed, reciting familiar prayers from a dozen different religious traditions, the words blending together in a quiet, multilingual chorus of faith and hope. In still others, there was only silence, the numb, stunned silence of people who had just witnessed something beyond their capacity to process or understand, people who sat motionless in the bottom of the boat, staring at nothing, waiting for rescue or death with equal passivity. Margaret Brown, the Denver socialite, who would later become famous as the unsinkable Molly Brown, was one of the passengers who refused to accept passivity. Seated in lifeboat number 6, under the command of Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, the same man who had been at the wheel when the Titanic struck the iceberg, Brown took charge of the situation with characteristic energy and determination. When Hitchens, overwhelmed by fear and despair, refused to row toward the screams of people in the water, Brown threatened to throw him overboard and organized the other women in the boat to take up the oars themselves. She distributed her own clothing to passengers who were suffering from exposure, and she kept up a steady stream of encouragement and practical advice that helped maintain morale during the long, freezing hours before the Carpathia arrived. Brown's reputation as a heroine of the Titanic disaster is well deserved, though the stories that grew up around her in the decades after the sinking were often embellished and exaggerated. The nickname Unsinkable Molly Brown was not used during her lifetime. It was coined after her death and popularized by a 1960 Broadway musical and a 1964 film. Brown herself preferred to be called Margaret, not Molly, and she would probably have been more amused than pleased by the larger-than-life persona that was created in her name. The rescue by the Carpathia was itself a remarkable feat of seamanship and human compassion. Captain Arthur Rostron, the Carpathia's master, was a deeply religious man and a highly experienced seaman, and his response to the Titanic's distress signal was a model of swift, decisive action. When the wireless operator on the Carpathia received the Titanic's CQD signal at approximately 12:35 in the morning, Rostron was asleep in his cabin. He was roused immediately, and within minutes he had assessed the situation, calculated the distance to the Titanic's reported position, and ordered the Carpathia to turn around and steam at maximum speed toward the sinking ship. The Carpathia was not a fast ship. Her normal cruising speed was about 14 knots, and her maximum rated speed was only slightly higher. But Rostron ordered every available ounce of steam to be directed to the engines, shutting down hot water and heating systems throughout the ship to conserve power. And the Carpathia reached a speed of approximately 17.5 knots, the fastest she had ever traveled. At the same time, Rostron organized a comprehensive rescue plan, assigning specific responsibilities to every officer and department head aboard. He ordered the ship's doctors to prepare for casualties, the stewards to prepare blankets, hot drinks and food, the engineers to have the gangway doors open and rope ladders ready, and the deck crew to have slings, chairs, and canvas bags ready to hoist aboard children and injured survivors. Rostron also had to navigate through the same ice field that had destroyed the Titanic, and he did so with extraordinary care and nerve, posting extra lookouts at every available vantage point and personally overseeing the navigation from the bridge. The Carpathia passed numerous icebergs during her dash to the rescue, some of them large enough to have posed a serious threat, and Rostron later acknowledged that the speed at which he was traveling through such dangerous waters was a calculated risk that he accepted because the alternative, arriving too late to save anyone, was unthinkable. The Carpathia arrived at the scene at approximately 4 a.m, just as the first faint light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the eastern horizon. The sight that greeted Rostron and his crew was one they would never forget. A vast, empty expanse of ocean strewn with icebergs and scattered across the dark water. The small, pitiful shapes of the Titanic's lifeboats, each one carrying its cargo of frozen, exhausted, grief-stricken survivors. The process of bringing the survivors aboard took more than 4 hours, and it was conducted with a tenderness and efficiency that reflected great credit on Rostron and his crew. As the survivors came aboard, the Carpathia's passengers and crew responded with an outpouring of generosity and compassion that was one of the few bright spots in the entire tragedy. Passengers gave up their cabins, their clothes, their food, and their blankets to the survivors. The ship's doctor treated the injured and the frostbitten. The stewards served hot soup, coffee, and brandy to people who had not eaten or drunk anything in more than 8 hours. And throughout it all, Rostron moved quietly among the survivors, offering words of comfort and reassurance. His calm, steady presence, a source of strength for people who had just endured the worst experience of their lives. The number of people who had been saved was 710. The number who had been lost was more than 1,500. And as the Carpathia turned away from the scene of the disaster and set course for New York, the survivors, gathered on the decks and in the lounges of their rescue ship, began the long, painful process of coming to terms with what they had experienced and what they had lost. Many of them had been separated from family members, husbands from wives, parents from children, brothers from sisters. And in the hours and days that followed, the Carpathia became a floating hospital of grief, a ship of mourning where the wails of the bereaved mingled with the quiet sobbing of those who were too exhausted or too numb to cry aloud. Among the most heart-wrenching scenes were those involving women who had been separated from their husbands during the evacuation and who now waited in agony for news that might never come. Some paced the decks, scanning the faces of every new group of survivors who emerged from the companionways, hoping against hope to see a familiar face. Others sat in the lounges, too devastated to move, clutching photographs and letters and small personal belongings that were the only tangible reminders of the men they had loved and lost. And a few, the fortunate few, experienced the overwhelming joy of reunion, of finding a husband or a father or a brother whom they had given up for dead. An experience so intense and so emotionally overwhelming that it could leave even the most composed Edwardian lady weeping openly in the arms of a stranger. The Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, worked almost continuously during the 3-day voyage to New York, transmitting the names of survivors and personal messages from the rescued passengers to anxious friends and family members on shore. He was assisted by Harold Bride, the Titanic's surviving wireless operator, who dragged himself to the wireless cabin despite his severe frostbite, and worked alongside Cottam until they were both ready to collapse from exhaustion. Their dedication ensured that the first comprehensive lists of survivors reached the public within 24 hours, though even these lists were incomplete and contained errors that caused additional anguish for families already in turmoil. The Titanic disaster also had a profound impact on the community of Southampton, the English port city from which the ship had sailed and where many of her crew had lived. Southampton was a working-class city whose economy was heavily dependent on the maritime industry, and a disproportionate number of the ship's crew, particularly the stokers, trimmers, stewards, and other lower-ranking workers, had been recruited from the city's dockside neighborhoods. When the news of the sinking reached Southampton, the impact on these close-knit communities was devastating. Nearly every street in the Chapel, Northam, and Nicholstown areas of the city lost at least one resident, and some streets lost a dozen or more. The Titanic Crew Memorial, erected in Southampton's East Park in 1915, lists the names of 549 crew members who lost their lives, and it remains a place of pilgrimage and reflection for the descendants of those who served and died aboard the ship. The economic impact of the disaster on Southampton was severe and long-lasting. Hundreds of families lost their primary breadwinners, and the meager death benefits provided by the White Star Line and various charitable organizations were inadequate to sustain them. Women who had been wives and homemakers were forced to find work, often in the same maritime industry that had taken their husbands, and children who should have been in school were sent out to earn money to help support their families. The Titanic Disaster Fund, established by the Lord Mayor of London, raised more than £414,000, a substantial sum, but its distribution was uneven and sometimes contentious, with some families receiving far more than others based on criteria that were not always transparent or fair. The Titanic carried within her steel walls not only passengers and cargo, but also the dreams and ambitions of an entire generation of immigrants who saw in America the promise of a life free from the constraints of poverty, persecution, and limited opportunity. For these passengers, the majority of whom traveled in third class, the Titanic was far more than a ship. She was a bridge between the old world and the new, a vessel of transformation that would carry them from the cramped, impoverished villages and cities of Europe to the vast, beckoning spaces of a continent where, they had been told, a man could make his fortune and a woman could raise her children in safety and dignity. The stories of these immigrants form some of the most moving chapters in the Titanic narrative. There was the Anderson family from Sweden, consisting of Anders and Alfrida Anderson, and their 5 children, the youngest of whom was only 2 years old. Anders was a farmer who had decided to emigrate after a series of bad harvests had left the family in financial difficulty, and he had purchased tickets for the entire family in third class. They were bound for Winnipeg, Manitoba, where Anders had heard that farmland was cheap and the soil was rich. All 7 members of the Anderson family perished in the sinking. There was the story of Anna Sophia Turja, a 17-year-old Finnish girl who was traveling alone to join her sister in Ashtabula, Ohio. Turja spoke no English, and when the collision occurred, she had no idea what was happening or what she should do. She was rescued almost by accident, spotted by a crew member who saw her wandering the corridors in confusion and who took her by the arm and led her to the boat deck, where she was placed in one of the last lifeboats to be launched. She later described the experience as dreamlike, a fog of incomprehension through which she moved without will or understanding, saved by the chance intervention of a stranger whose name she never learned. There was Daniel Buckley, a 21-year-old Irishman from County Cork who had emigrated to escape poverty and political oppression. Buckley had initially been prevented from reaching the boat deck by locked gates at the entrance to the third-class stairwells, and he later testified that he and several other men had to break through the barriers by force. When he finally reached the boat deck, he was turned away from the lifeboats by an officer enforcing the women and children first rule. In desperation, Buckley climbed into a lifeboat and covered himself with a woman's shawl, hiding among the female passengers until the boat was safely lowered to the water. He survived the sinking, but was killed 6 years later, at the age of 27, fighting in the trenches of France during the First World War. The story of the Danbom family illustrates both the hopes and the heartbreak of the immigrant experience. Ernst Gilbert Danbom, his wife Anna, and their 5-month-old son Gilbert were traveling from Stanton, Iowa, where Ernst had been working on a relative's farm, to visit Anna's parents in Sweden. Or at least, that was the official reason for their journey. In fact, the Danboms were deeply homesick, and they had been planning to return to Sweden permanently. But they changed their minds during the voyage and decided to go back to America after all, booking return passage on another ship. They never got the chance. All 3 members of the Danbom family were lost in the sinking. These immigrant stories, taken together, form a portrait of the human cost of the disaster that goes beyond the statistics of lives lost and lives saved. Each name on the passenger manifest represents a unique constellation of hopes, fears, plans and dreams, a fully realized human life that was cut short by a collision with an iceberg on a cold April night. And when we remember that many of these people had already endured years of hardship and sacrifice just to reach the dock at Southampton or Queenstown, the tragedy takes on an additional dimension of cruelty, a sense that fate was not merely indifferent, but actively malicious, destroying these fragile human hopes at the very moment when they were closest to fulfillment. The aftermath of the Titanic disaster produced not only grief and outrage, but also a remarkable outpouring of creativity and artistic expression. Poets, songwriters, playwrights, and novelists seized upon the story almost immediately, finding in its dramatic intensity and its stark moral contrast a subject that seemed tailor-made for artistic treatment. Within weeks of the sinking, broadside ballads were being sold on the streets of London and New York. Simple, sentimental verses that mourned the dead and celebrated the heroes. Gospel songs about the Titanic became fixtures in the repertoire of African American churches, including the famous "God Moves on the Water" and the haunting "When That Great Ship Went Down." Folk singer Leadbelly recorded his version of the Titanic story, "The Titanic," in 1948. and it became one of the most widely known folk songs in America. The visual arts also responded to the disaster with remarkable speed and emotional intensity. Newspaper illustrators produced dramatic images of the sinking ship, the struggling passengers, and the brave musicians playing on the tilting deck. Images that helped to fix the Titanic story in the public imagination, long before the advent of film and television. And in the fine arts, painters like Willie Steuer and Ken Marshall produced detailed, historically informed depictions of the disaster that have become definitive visual representations of the event. The Titanic also became a powerful symbol in political discourse, invoked by speakers of every ideological persuasion to illustrate their particular understanding of the disaster's meaning. For socialists and labor activists, the Titanic was proof of the murderous indifference of the capitalist class, a floating demonstration of the principle that the rich would always save themselves at the expense of the poor. For conservatives and traditionalists, the chivalric behavior of the men who stood aside to let women and children board the lifeboats was proof of the enduring strength of traditional gender roles and the nobility of masculine self-sacrifice. For feminists, the same behavior was evidence of a patronizing system that treated women as helpless creatures in need of male protection, while denying them the political rights and economic opportunities that would have made them genuinely independent. These competing interpretations have continued to evolve over the decades, reflecting the changing values and priorities of each successive generation. The 1955 film, A Night to Remember, based on Walter Lord's best-selling book of the same title, presented the disaster as a tragedy of British stoicism and quiet heroism, a story in which duty, honor, and self-sacrifice were the dominant themes. The 1997 James Cameron film, Titanic, by contrast, framed the disaster as a story of class conflict and individual liberation, with the romance between the working-class Jack Dawson and the upper-class Rose DeWitt Bukater serving as a vehicle for a critique of the rigid social hierarchies that the ship embodied. Each new generation finds in the Titanic story a mirror for its own preoccupations and anxieties, and the story's ability to absorb and reflect these changing perspectives is one of the reasons it has remained so enduringly powerful. The Titanic is not a fixed narrative, but a living one, a story that is constantly being rewritten and reinterpreted as new generations bring their own questions and concerns to bear on the events of April 1912. The role of women in the Titanic story deserves particular attention, both because of the ways in which their experiences were shaped by the gender norms of the Edwardian era, and because of the remarkable courage and resilience that many of them displayed in the face of unimaginable adversity. The Women and Children First Protocol, while it saved the lives of many female passengers, also placed women in an agonizing position, forcing them to choose between their own survival and their desire to remain with their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons. Some women refused to board the lifeboats without their husbands, a decision that was respected by some officers and overridden by others. Ida Strauss, as we have already seen, chose to stay with her husband and die beside him rather than save herself. Other women made the opposite choice, boarding the lifeboats and then living for decades with the guilt of having survived when their loved ones had not. The experience of the stewardesses, the female crew members who worked in the first and second class sections of the ship, adds another dimension to the story of women on the Titanic. These were working women, professionals who had chosen a career at sea at a time when such choices were unusual and sometimes controversial. They were expected to perform their duties with efficiency and grace under the most challenging circumstances. And during the evacuation, many of them displayed extraordinary courage and professionalism, guiding passengers to the lifeboats, distributing life belts, calming frightened children, and in several cases, returning to the lower decks to search for passengers who had not yet been notified of the danger. There were 18 stewardesses aboard the Titanic, and all but 3 of them survived, partly because they were given priority access to the lifeboats as women, but also because their knowledge of the ship's layout and their training in emergency procedures gave them a significant advantage in reaching the boat deck. The 3 stewardesses who perished were all working in areas of the ship that were flooded early in the sinking, and their deaths, like those of the engineers and the postal workers, were the result of their dedication to their duties rather than any failure to recognize the danger. One of the most curious and most frequently discussed aspects of the Titanic story is the question of premonitions, those mysterious feelings of unease and foreboding that several passengers and their family members reported experiencing before and during the voyage. Esther Hart, the mother of 7-year-old Eva Hart, was so convinced that the Titanic was doomed that she refused to sleep during the crossing, sitting up in her cabin each night fully clothed, her lifebelt within arm's reach. Her premonition, which seemed irrational and neurotic at the time, proved to be tragically justified, and she credited her wakefulness with saving her daughter's life, as she was able to dress Eva and carry her to the boat deck within minutes of the collision. Other accounts of premonitions are more difficult to evaluate. Several passengers reportedly cancelled their bookings at the last minute, citing vague feelings of unease or specific warnings from friends and family members. J. Pierpont Morgan, the American financier who was part owner of the White Star Line, was booked on the Titanic's maiden voyage, but cancelled his passage at the last moment, citing ill health. Henry Clay Frick, the Pittsburgh steel magnate, also cancelled his booking, reportedly at his wife's insistence. And the Reverend J. Stuart Holden, who had been invited to preach at a church in New York, was prevented from sailing by his wife's sudden illness. Whether these cancellations were the result of genuine premonitions, simple coincidence, or the kind of last-minute changes of plan that are common to any ocean voyage, they have contributed to the aura of fatality that surrounds the Titanic story. The sense that the disaster was somehow predetermined and that the ship was sailing toward a destiny from which there was no escape. The fate of the animals aboard the Titanic is a small but touching footnote to the larger story. The ship carried a number of dogs, most of them belonging to first-class passengers, who were housed in kennels on F deck and exercised on the poop deck by crew members assigned to animal care. During the evacuation, at least 3 dogs were rescued by their owners, who carried them into the lifeboats wrapped in blankets or concealed in bags. The 3 survivors were all small dogs: a Pekingese owned by Henry and Myra Harper, a Pomeranian owned by Margaret Hayes, and another Pomeranian owned by Elizabeth Barrett Rothschild. The larger dogs, which could not be easily concealed or carried, were left aboard the ship, and all of them perished. One particularly poignant story involves Anne Elizabeth Isham, a first-class passenger who reportedly refused to board a lifeboat without her Great Dane, a dog too large to be accommodated in the small boats. According to some accounts, Isham returned to her cabin to be with her dog, and both perished in the sinking. Other accounts suggest that she was simply unable to reach the lifeboats in time. Her body was reportedly recovered by one of the cable ships that searched the disaster area in the weeks after the sinking, and she was said to have been found with her arms wrapped around a large dog. This detail, whether true or embellished, speaks to the deep bond between humans and animals, and to the impossible choices that the Titanic disaster forced upon its passengers. The postal cargo aboard the Titanic was another source of lasting fascination. The ship was carrying approximately 3,400 bags of mail, containing an estimated 7 million individual pieces of correspondence, including letters, postcards, and packages bound for addresses across the United States and Canada. All of the mail was lost in the sinking, and the contents of those 7 million letters, the words of love and business and friendship and grief that they contained, were dissolved by the sea and scattered across the ocean floor. It is one of the more melancholy aspects of the disaster, this silent destruction of so many human voices, so many private thoughts and hopes and plans, committed to paper and entrusted to the Titanic's postal workers with the expectation that they would be delivered safely to their intended recipients. The financial losses from the sinking extended far beyond the value of the ship herself. Passengers in first class had been carrying substantial quantities of money, jewelry, and other valuables, and the total value of lost personal property was estimated at several $1,000,000. Among the most valuable items lost was a jeweled copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, bound in gold and inlaid with more than 1,500 precious stones, which had been sold at auction in London shortly before the voyage and was being transported to New York by the buyer. The book was estimated to be worth approximately £2,000 at the time, an enormous sum, and its loss at the bottom of the Atlantic has made it one of the most famous missing treasures in history. Other valuable items lost in the sinking included paintings, manuscripts, fine wines, and an automobile, a Renault Type CB Coupe de Ville that belonged to William Carter of Philadelphia, and that was being shipped in the Titanic's cargo hold. Carter later filed a claim against the White Star Line for the loss of the car and its contents, which he valued at $5,000, a claim that was eventually settled for far less. The Titanic's cargo manifest also included more mundane items that serve as a reminder of the ship's role as a working vessel of commerce. She carried cases of shelled walnuts, crates of fresh vegetables, rolls of linoleum, bundles of newspapers, boxes of books, barrels of wine and spirits, cases of rubber goods, and bales of raw linen. She carried ostrich feathers, which were a popular fashion accessory in 1912, and cases of opium, which was a legal pharmaceutical ingredient at the time, and was shipped in substantial quantities between Asia and the medical establishments of Europe and America. All of these goods, along with everything else aboard the ship, went to the bottom of the Atlantic on the morning of April the 15th, joining the personal belongings, the mail, and the mortal remains of more than 1,500 men, women, and children in a watery grave that would remain undisturbed for more than 70 years. The question of why the Titanic story continues to grip the human imagination with such extraordinary power is one that has occupied historians, psychologists, and cultural critics for more than a century. There is no single, simple answer, but several factors seem to contribute to the story's enduring appeal. First, there is the sheer dramatic perfection of the narrative, the way in which the story unfolds with the inevitability and the emotional intensity of a classical tragedy. The hubris of the builders, the grandeur of the ship, the confidence of the passengers, the beauty of the night, the sudden, unexpected blow, the slow descent into chaos and death, the heroism and the cowardice, the love and the loss. All of these elements combine to create a story that seems almost too perfectly constructed to be real. A narrative that reads like fiction but carries the additional emotional weight of being entirely true. Second, there is the universality of the story's themes. The Titanic disaster raises questions about human nature, about the relationship between technology and nature, about the meaning of courage and the nature of sacrifice, that are as relevant today as they were in 1912. We live in a world that is, if anything, even more dependent on technology than the Edwardian world was, and the story of a great technological achievement destroyed by a force of nature continues to resonate with our own anxieties about the limitations of human power and the fragility of the systems we rely upon. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there is the intensely personal quality of the Titanic story, the way in which the vast, impersonal tragedy of the sinking is refracted through the individual experiences of the passengers and crew. Each one a fully realized human being with a life that was as rich and as complex and as precious as our own. It is this quality, more than any other, that gives the Titanic story its extraordinary emotional power and its enduring claim on our attention. We do not remember the Titanic because of the ship. We remember the Titanic because of the people. There is another dimension of the Titanic story that deserves our attention, and that is the extraordinary role played by the ship's officers during the evacuation, men whose individual decisions, made under unimaginable pressure and in near complete darkness, determined the survival or death of hundreds of people. These men were not heroes in the conventional sense, nor were they villains. They were professionals, trained seamen who found themselves confronting a situation for which no amount of training could have fully prepared them, and who responded with a mixture of competence, improvisation, and human fallibility that is as instructive as it is moving. First Officer William Murdoch, who was in command on the bridge at the moment of the collision, bore a particularly heavy burden. It was Murdoch who gave the order to turn the ship hard to starboard in an attempt to avoid the iceberg, and it was Murdoch who ordered the engines reversed, a decision that some historians have argued actually made the situation worse by reducing the effectiveness of the rudder at the critical moment. Whether Murdoch's actions were optimal or not, they were the product of split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. And it is difficult to second-guess a man who had only 37 seconds between the sighting of the iceberg and the collision. After the collision, Murdoch took charge of the evacuation on the starboard side of the ship, and he is generally credited with having managed his lifeboats more efficiently than Lightoller managed his on the port side. Murdoch adopted a pragmatic interpretation of the women and children first rule, allowing men to board the lifeboats when no women or children were waiting, a decision that saved the lives of a number of male passengers who would almost certainly have perished under Lightoller's stricter interpretation. Some accounts suggest that Murdoch shot himself in the final moments, though this claim is disputed and may have originated from sensationalized press reports rather than reliable eyewitness testimony. His body was never recovered. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall played a crucial but often overlooked role in the events of the night. Boxall was the ship's navigation officer, and it was he who calculated the Titanic's position after the collision, a position that was transmitted in the distress calls and that guided the Carpathia to the scene of the disaster. There has been considerable debate about the accuracy of Boxall's calculation, with some historians arguing that the position he provided was several miles off from the Titanic's actual location. But whatever its precise accuracy, Boxall's calculation was close enough to bring the Carpathia to the right general area. And without it, the rescue might have taken much longer, or might not have happened at all. Boxall was assigned to lifeboat number 2, from which he fired green flares to attract the attention of the approaching Carpathia. He survived the disaster and later gave testimony at both inquiries that was detailed, precise, and invaluable in reconstructing the timeline of events. 6th Officer James Moody, the youngest of the Titanic's officers, was the man who answered the telephone call from Lookout Frederick Fleet and relayed the iceberg warning to Murdoch. Moody assisted with the loading and launching of the lifeboats throughout the evacuation, and he was one of the few officers who worked on both sides of the ship, moving between the port and starboard boat decks as needed. He was last seen near Collapsible A, one of the canvas-sided emergency boats that was not launched properly and that floated off the deck half submerged as the ship went down. Moody died in the sinking, and his body was never recovered. He was 24 years old. The story of Collapsible B is one of the most harrowing survival tales of the entire disaster. This was one of the 4 Engelhart collapsible lifeboats carried on the roof of the officers' quarters on the boat deck, and when the ship began her final plunge, Collapsible B was washed overboard and landed in the water, upside down. A group of approximately 30 men, including 2nd Officer Lightoller, wireless operator Harold Bride, and passenger Jack Thayer, managed to climb onto the overturned hull and cling to it throughout the long, freezing hours before the Carpathia arrived. The scene on the bottom of Collapsible B was nightmarish. The men stood and knelt on the overturned keel, which was barely above the waterline, swaying and shifting with every movement of the sea. They were soaked and freezing, and as the hours passed, the sea gradually rose higher against the sides of the boat, threatening to submerge them entirely. Lightoller took command, organizing the men into a line and directing them to lean in unison from one side to the other to counterbalance the rocking of the boat, a technique that he later credited with preventing the hull from rolling over and dumping them all into the water. Several men died during the night, their bodies slipping silently from the hull into the sea. And by the time the Carpathia arrived, the survivors were in a state of extreme exhaustion and hypothermia, barely able to move or speak. The Titanic disaster also had far-reaching consequences for the design and regulation of future ocean liners. Beyond the immediate reforms enacted by the Solis Convention, the disaster prompted a fundamental rethinking of ship design philosophy. Future ships were built with higher watertight bulkheads that extended further above the waterline, reducing the risk of the cascading flooding that had doomed the Titanic. Double hulls became standard, providing an additional layer of protection against puncture, and the provision of lifeboat capacity was transformed from an afterthought into a central element of ship design, with dedicated lifeboat stations and davit systems designed to ensure that every passenger and crew member could be accommodated. The International Ice Patrol, established in 1913 as a direct result of the disaster, has operated continuously ever since, monitoring iceberg activity in the North Atlantic shipping lanes and broadcasting warnings to all vessels in the area. In more than a century of operations, the Ice Patrol has tracked thousands of icebergs and has been credited with preventing numerous potential collisions. Since the patrol began its work, no ship heeding its warnings has been lost to iceberg collision, a testament to the effectiveness of the system and a fitting memorial to the lives that were lost, because no such system existed in April of 1912. The wireless reforms that followed the disaster were equally significant. Before the Titanic, there was no requirement for ships to maintain a continuous wireless watch, and many smaller vessels carried no wireless equipment at all. The disaster demonstrated, with terrible clarity, the life or death importance of wireless communication at sea, and the subsequent regulations ensured that every ship of significant size would be equipped with wireless apparatus, and that at least one operator would be on duty at all times, day and night, ready to receive distress signals and coordinate rescue operations. These changes did not come too late to save those who died aboard the Titanic, but they came in time to save countless others in the decades that followed. The wireless reforms alone are estimated to have saved thousands of lives, enabling ships in distress to summon help that would otherwise never have arrived. And the lifeboat regulations, so simple and so obvious in retrospect, have ensured that no passenger ship has ever again sailed with insufficient lifeboat capacity, a reform that cost more than 1,500 lives to achieve, but that has protected millions of passengers in the centuries since. The Titanic also changed forever the relationship between the public and the great ocean liners. Before the disaster, the transatlantic crossing was seen as a glamorous adventure, a journey that combined the excitement of ocean travel with the luxury of a floating hotel. After the disaster, a note of anxiety crept into the public's perception of ocean travel, a quiet awareness that the sea was not merely a stage for human drama, but a vast, powerful, indifferent force that could destroy the mightiest works of human engineering in a matter of hours. The great liners of the 20s and 30s, the Queen Mary, the Normandy, the Rex, were still objects of wonder and admiration, but they were also objects of scrutiny, subject to safety inspections and regulatory oversight that would have been unthinkable before 1912. The personal effects recovered from the Titanic wreck site have become some of the most poignant artifacts in the history of human loss. A pair of leather shoes, still laced, lying side by side on the ocean floor, marking the place where a body once rested before it was consumed by the deep-sea environment. A china doll's head, painted with delicate features, the toy of some child who carried it aboard the ship and who may or may not have survived to play with it again. A watch, stopped at the moment its owner entered the water, its hands frozen forever at 2:16 in the morning. A permanent record of the instant when one human life crossed the threshold between the living and the dead. These objects speak to us across the years with a power that words alone cannot convey. They are the physical traces of human lives that were lived and lost on a single night in April 1912. Tangible reminders that the people who sailed aboard the Titanic were not characters in a story, but real, breathing, feeling human beings who carried with them the same mix of hopes and fears and dreams and anxieties that we carry ourselves every day through the ordinary and extraordinary moments of our own lives. And so, the story of the Titanic continues, not as a fixed, finished narrative, but as a living, evolving conversation between the past and the present, between the dead and the living, between the world that built the ship and the world that inherited her legacy. It is a story that refuses to be contained by any single interpretation or perspective, a story that grows richer and more complex with every new discovery, every new analysis, every new generation that comes to it with fresh eyes and fresh questions. More than a century has passed since the Titanic slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, and in that time, the world has changed in ways that the passengers and crew of the great ship could never have imagined. The empires that dominated the map in 1912 have fallen and been replaced by new nations and new alliances. The technologies that seemed so miraculous, the wireless telegraph, the electric light, the mighty steam engine, have been superseded by inventions that would have seemed like pure magic to the Edwardians. Satellite communications, nuclear power, the internet, the smartphone. The social hierarchies that were so rigidly enforced aboard the Titanic, the locked gates and the separate dining rooms, and the invisible barriers between the classes, have been challenged and, in many ways, dismantled by a century of democratic reform and social revolution. And yet the Titanic story endures. It endures not because of the ship, magnificent as she was, and not because of the statistics, staggering as they are, but because of the human beings who sailed aboard her, the men and women and children whose stories we have been exploring together throughout these long, quiet hours. It endures because of Isidor and Ida Strauss, holding hands on the deck as the water rose around them, choosing love over survival in a moment of transcendent grace. It endures because of Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in his evening clothes, facing death with a glass of brandy, and a remark that was equal parts courage and performance. It endures because of Wallace Hartley and his musicians, playing their instruments on the tilting deck, filling the freezing air with beauty in the midst of horror. It endures because of the nameless mother in third class, who held her children close and sang to them in a language that no one around her understood, comforting them with the sound of her voice as the great ship died beneath their feet. It endures because of the stoker who stayed at his post in the boiler room, shoveling coal into the furnaces until the water swallowed him, ensuring that the lights kept burning so that others might find their way to safety. It endures because of the wireless operator who kept his fingers moving across the telegraph key, tapping out his desperate plea for help into the silence of the Atlantic night, until the water reached his door and the silence was complete. These are the images that remain when all the technical details have been exhausted and all the statistics have been compiled and all the analyses have been performed. These are the moments that define the Titanic story, not as a tale of engineering failure or navigational error or regulatory inadequacy, though it was all of these things, but as a tale of human beings confronted with the ultimate test and responding in ways that span the entire spectrum of human behavior, from the most abject cowardice to the most sublime heroism. And perhaps that is why the Titanic story refuses to fade, why it continues to captivate each new generation, why it has become something more than history and something closer to myth. Because in the end, the Titanic is not about a ship. It is about us. It is about the choices we make when the stakes are highest, about the things we value most when everything else is stripped away. It is about love and fear and duty and sacrifice, and the thin, fragile line that separates the civilized surface of our lives from the primal chaos that lies just beneath. The passengers and crew of the Titanic were not fundamentally different from us. They were people of their time, shaped by the same hopes and fears and contradictions that shape us today. They wanted what we want: safety, comfort, love, purpose, a future for their children, a sense of meaning in their lives. And when those wants were suddenly and violently taken from them, they responded in ways that were as varied and as unpredictable as human nature itself. Some rose to the occasion with a courage that still takes our breath away. Others faltered and fell. Most did something in between, navigating the impossible terrain of the crisis with a mixture of bravery and bewilderment that is, in the end, the most human response of all. The wreck of the Titanic lies today at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic, in an area of the ocean that is among the most remote and inhospitable on Earth. The bow section, which was the first to reach the bottom, landed upright on the seabed and has retained much of its original shape, though the ravages of time and the corrosive effects of the deep sea environment are gradually reducing it to a crumbling ruin. The stern section, which suffered catastrophic damage during the breakup and the 2.5-mile fall to the ocean floor, is badly collapsed and barely recognizable. Between the two sections, the debris field stretches for roughly 2,000 feet, a silent, ghostly landscape of scattered artifacts and decayed structural elements that constitute the final resting place of more than 1,500 human souls. There is something profoundly moving about the fact that the Titanic still exists, that the physical remains of the ship are down there in the darkness, slowly dissolving into the mud and the silt of the ocean floor. It gives the story a tangible, material reality that sets it apart from most historical events, a sense that the past is not merely a collection of words and images, but a real, physical place that can be visited and touched and seen, even if only through the cameras of deep-sea submersibles. And yet, even as the wreck decays, the stories live on. The stories of the people who sailed aboard the Titanic, the stories that we have been sharing together, continue to be told and retold, passed down from generation to generation, preserved in books and films and museum exhibitions, and in the memories of the descendants of those who lived and those who died. These stories are the true legacy of the Titanic, more enduring than steel, more valuable than gold, more powerful than any engine ever built. Because in the end, what the Titanic story teaches us is not a lesson about shipbuilding or navigation or maritime safety, though it teaches us all of these things. What it teaches us, at its deepest level, is a lesson about ourselves, about the extraordinary capacity of human beings to create and to destroy, to hope and to fear, to love and to grieve, to face the abyss with courage or with terror, and in every case, to leave behind a story that deserves to be told. The Atlantic Ocean, vast and dark and endlessly patient, keeps its secrets well. The currents that carried the iceberg into the Titanic's path still flow, cold and slow and indifferent, through the same waters where 1,500 people died on a starless night more than 100 years ago. The stars that look down on the sinking ship are the same stars that look down on us tonight, unchanged, unknowing, eternal. And somewhere, far below the surface, in the permanent midnight of the deep ocean, the remains of the Titanic lie scattered across the seabed like the fragments of a broken dream, a monument to human ambition and human vulnerability, to the things we build and the things that can destroy them. The passengers and crew of the Titanic are gone now, all of them. The last survivor, Milvina Dean, died in 2009, and with her passing, the living connection to the disaster was broken. There is no one left who remembers, no one who can speak from personal experience about what it was like to stand on the deck of the great ship as she went down, to hear the band playing and the steam escaping, and the voices of the drowning rising from the dark water. But their stories remain, preserved in the testimony they gave, and the letters they wrote, and the memories they shared with their children and their grandchildren before the silence claimed them, too. And that is why we tell these stories. Not because they are history, though they are. Not because they are dramatic, though they are that too. But because they are human, deeply, painfully, beautifully human. And because in telling them, we keep faith with the men and women and children who lived them, who suffered them, who died in the freezing water, or survived to carry the burden of memory for the rest of their days. We tell these stories because they deserve to be told, because every life is a story worth remembering, and because the measure of a civilization is not the ships it builds, but the care it takes with the voices of those it has lost. The Titanic sailed into the darkness on a cold April night, carrying with her the hopes and dreams of more than 2,200 human beings. She sailed with confidence and pride, and the unshakable belief that nothing in the world could stop her. And when the world stopped her, when the iceberg found her hull, and the sea found its way in, and the great ship began her slow, inexorable descent into the abyss, the people aboard her discovered something that all the technology and all the wealth and all the confidence in the world could not have taught them. That human life is fragile, that the future is uncertain, and that the only thing we truly have is each other. That is the emotional human story behind the Titanic disaster. It is a story of love and loss, of courage and fear, of hope and heartbreak. It is a story that belongs not to any single class or nation or era, but to all of humanity, a shared inheritance of sorrow and wonder that connects us across the years to the men and women and children who stood on the deck of the most famous ship in history and watched the stars reflected in the dark, still water of the North Atlantic, not knowing that the ice was ahead, that the night was coming, and that nothing would ever be quite the same again. And across the water, in the soft, grey light of an April dawn, the Carpathia came, her crew at the ready, her engines humming with a purpose, born of compassion and courage, threading her way through the ice to gather up the survivors and carry them to safety. She came, as help always comes, not soon enough to save everyone, but soon enough to save some, soon enough to remind us that even in the midst of catastrophe, the instinct to help, to comfort, to reach out across the darkness and pull a stranger from the freezing sea is one of the most powerful and most beautiful forces in all of human experience. The Titanic story, the emotional human story of more than 2,000 souls adrift in the cold heart of the Atlantic, is one that the world has never stopped telling. We tell it in books and films and songs and monuments. We tell it in museums where the recovered artifacts lie in glass cases, mute witnesses to a night that changed everything. We tell it in the quiet moments of reflection when we pause to consider what it means to be alive, to be mortal, to be human in a universe that is vast and indifferent and achingly beautiful. And we tell it here, together, in these quiet hours, because some stories are too important to forget, and this is one of them. The Titanic sailed, and the Titanic sank, and the world was forever changed. But the people who sailed aboard her, the people whose stories we have shared tonight, they are not gone. They live on in the stories we tell about them, in the lessons we have drawn from their experience, and in the deep, abiding human capacity for wonder and grief and love that their story awakens in all of us. A century later, under the same silent stars.